Chapter 1, Wind and Snow. A frigid northerly wind howled as it carried snow and ice, whipping against people's cheeks with sharp, stinging pain. In this raging snowy weather, the streets were completely deserted, devoid of any passerby. Even small street vendors had long packed up their stalls and returned home to sit by the warm hearth, sipping a few cups of hot wine to ward off the bitter cold. Yet, amidst the bone-chilling cold and blinding snowfall, a small figure struggled against the wind and snow, trudging forward with great difficulty. Clad in thin, tattered clothes, the child's tiny hands, purple from the cold, clutched two slightly darkened steamed buns, desperately trying to use their own warmth to keep the buns from freezing solid. It was a little beggar, no older than 7 or 8 years old. His gaunt face was devoid of any color, the result of prolonged hunger. His frail body, as delicate as a withered blade of grass, seemed as if it could be swept away by the icy wind at any moment. The ragged clothing he wore offered no protection against the biting cold. Countless frostbitten cracks on his skin had festered, freezing over and clinging stubbornly to his flesh. Even so, the little beggar's small back remained straight like a pillar amidst the storm. Unafraid of the cold, he pressed forward step by step, his gaze unwavering and resolute. "Hey! Share some of those buns with us!" At that moment, a group of teenage boys, also dressed in tattered clothing and around 15 or 16 years old, emerged from a narrow alley and blocked the little beggar's path. "No! These are for my mother!" The little beggar, seemingly recognizing the boys, instinctively shrank back, clutching the 2 steamed buns in his arms even tighter. "Cut the nonsense! We're starving!" One of the boys, equally thin and frail, stepped forward, reaching out to snatch the buns from the little beggar's grasp. "No! These are for my mother!" The little beggar quickly squatted down, curling himself into a ball, using his small body to shield the 2 steamed buns he had struggled to beg for. "You damn brat! So ungrateful! Brothers, teach him a lesson!" The skinny teenager shouted angrily, leading with a kick that sent the little beggar tumbling. The others immediately joined in, punching and kicking him relentlessly. "No, these are for my mother!" Despite enduring the excruciating pain, the little beggar gritted his teeth and shouted, but he didn't let out a single cry from the brutal beating. "Damn it! Pry his hands open for me!" The skinny teenager barked fiercely. The others pinned the little beggar to the ground, forcefully snatching the 2 steamed buns from his grasp. They then fawningly handed them to the skinny teenager. "Brother Jack Harper here, enjoy." The teenager, named Jack Harper, grabbed one of the buns, took a huge bite, chewing contentedly, and then generously waved his hand. "Split the other one among yourselves." The group of teenagers cheered, dividing up the remaining bun without a second thought for the child lying sprawled on the snowy ground, his face bloodied and battered. Seeing the 2 steamed buns he had worked so hard to get stolen, the little beggar thought of his mother, who hadn't eaten in days. A surge of fury rose in his chest. His small body slowly pushed itself up from the ground, and a growl, completely unfitting for someone his age, escaped his lips. "Give me back the buns!" With that growl, his frail body lunged forward. He was already small, barely reaching Jack Harper's waist, and after going so long without a proper meal, he was weak and out of strength. His charge did nothing to harm Jack Harper. However, this act of defiance enraged Jack Harper. He cursed, grabbed the child, and delivered a thunderous slap, causing the boy's already pale face, frozen from the cold, to swell up, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Ethan Blake, you bastard! So what if I take your buns? You dare fight me? Let's see if I don't beat you to death." Jack Harper snarled viciously, raising his hand for another slap. It turned out, the little beggar's name was Ethan Blake. Little Ethan Blake was struck so hard that his head spun, but his stubborn mouth still shouted, "Give me back my bun! Give me back my bun! You little bastard, you've got a tough backbone." Jack Harper slapped him a few more times. Seeing Ethan still refusing to yield, he threw him onto the snowy ground and stomped directly on his stomach. Little Ethan Blake curled up in pain, lying still for a long while. "Brother Jack Harper, stop hitting him. If you kill him, you'll have to face the authorities." A young boy, frightened by Jack Harper's cruelty, and seeing Ethan barely clinging to life, hurriedly pulled Jack Harper back. They were all beggars in this area. Aside from begging, they resorted to petty theft and other misdeeds. Among them, the boy named Jack Harper was the most ruthless yet also loyal, gradually becoming the leader of the beggars. Regardless of age, they all called him Brother Jack Harper. As for little Ethan Blake, though he was also a beggar, he had never joined their group. Jack Harper had long wanted to deal with him. Today, as Ethan happened to pass by with food in hand, it was an opportunity Jack Harper wouldn't let slip. But beating someone so viciously carried risks. If it led to a death, even beggars couldn't escape the law's scrutiny. Jack Harper spat a thick glob of phlegm, landing it squarely on Ethan Blake's face, and snarled, "Dead is better. At least he'd have food and drink, no more starving and freezing like this." Despite his tough words, he feared the authorities. He stepped forward and kicked Ethan Blake again, but seeing that the boy truly wasn't moving, he angrily shouted, "You little bastard, stop playing dead. I'll spare you today." Humph. With that, he led the group of boys away, swaggering off. Cough, cough, cough. After a long while, Ethan Blake finally let out a weak cough, attempting to crawl up from the snowy ground. However, his entire body ached, drained of all strength, and he couldn't help but let out a groan of pain. The incident that occurred here was witnessed by quite a few people, but they remained indifferent. No one stepped forward, and as soon as they saw Jack Harper leading his men away, they simply returned to their own busy affairs. As for the little beggar lying on the ground, whether he lived or died, what did it matter to them? "Mother, I swear, I will bring food back for you." Ethan Blake lay on the snow, gritting his teeth in determination. Yet his frail body, after enduring the bitter cold and the beating, felt as fragile as a thin sheet of ice, ready to shatter and disappear at any moment. The snowstorm howled relentlessly, much like the cold-hearted people around him. It showed no mercy to the little beggar, instead pelting his thin, weak body with snow and ice, as if flaunting its power. From a small restaurant in the distance, the elderly innkeeper with snow-white hair stood in the warmth of his establishment, gazing at Ethan Blake lying motionless in the snow. He sighed deeply and murmured, "Perhaps it's better this way. At least, he won't have to suffer in this world anymore." "Heh, heh. Innkeeper, you're wrong to say that. Everyone is born into this world for a reason. A boy so young dying like this would be a real pity." At that moment, a young Taoist priest dining in the restaurant approached, glanced outside, and, ignoring the falling snow, walked out. The old innkeeper shook his head with a bitter smile, refraining from commenting further on the priest's words. The Taoist priest strode over to Ethan Blake, bent down, and placed his hand near the boy's nose. Realizing he was still breathing, the priest leaned down and lifted him up, saying, "It seems fortune is on your side today. I suddenly feel like saving someone." Carrying Ethan Blake back to the restaurant, the priest called for the waiter to bring a brazier closer. While warming the boy up, he inspected his injuries. "Fortunately, they're just surface wounds. This child must be starving. Waiter, prepare a bowl of hot porridge, not too thick." With that, he retrieved a small white jade bottle, poured out a single white pill, and slipped it into Ethan Blake's mouth. The waiter, a boy not yet 20, hesitated to act on his own and turned to the innkeeper for guidance. The old shopkeeper nodded and then added, "Just a little salt." The waiter quickly hurried off. As warmth gradually returned to his body, Ethan Blake slowly regained consciousness. He found himself lying on a wooden bench, next to a cozy, comforting brazier. Moreover, the aches throughout his body seemed to have eased significantly. Seeing the young Taoist priest nearby, Ethan Blake sat up from the bench and asked, "Was it you who saved me?" The young Taoist priest chuckled. "Is there anyone else here?" Ethan Blake felt a bit embarrassed, scratching his head, unsure of what to say. "Warm yourself up first, and later have some rice porridge. You'll feel better in no time." The Taoist priest gently patted Ethan Blake's head. Though the boy appeared frail, his bright eyes exuded determination, which made the priest feel a certain fondness for him. At the mention of rice porridge, Ethan Blake's stomach growled loudly. But just moments later, Ethan shook his head and said, "Thank you, sir, for saving me, but I can't stay here to eat porridge. My mother hasn't eaten for days. I need to go and find something for her." With that, Ethan knelt down, bowing deeply to the Taoist priest, before staggering to his feet and heading for the door. "Little one, where can you possibly go to beg for food in this heavy snow? I'll give you some steamed buns instead. Drink some hot porridge first to regain your strength, and then take the buns back for your mother. Wouldn't that be better?" The Taoist priest hadn't expected the child to be so devoted to his mother, thinking of her even in his own hunger. His admiration for Ethan grew as he quickly tried to persuade him. Ethan's small frame shivered. That's true. In such heavy snow, where could he go to beg? And who would even give him food? Thinking this through, Ethan turned back, knelt down, and bowed twice more to the Taoist priest. "Sir, my mother always says, if someone gives you a drop of water, repay them with a spring. I have nothing to offer now, so I can only bow to you in gratitude." "Ha ha!" The Taoist priest laughed heartily. Ethan's young yet resolute voice was truly admirable. Seeing that Ethan was about to bow for a third time, the priest waved his sleeve, and a gentle force lifted the boy's small frame, preventing him from kneeling further. "A man's knees are as valuable as gold. Don't kneel so easily before others." Ethan was stunned, staring at the Taoist priest in curiosity. There was clearly a distance between them, yet with just a wave of his hand, the priest had managed to lift him effortlessly. How extraordinary. "Ah! He must be a martial arts master." The thought suddenly popped into Ethan's young mind. During her free moments, his mother often told him fascinating stories, including legends of people like this. Seeing Ethan staring at him in awe, the Taoist priest laughed again and beckoned him over. "Don't just stand there. Come closer to the fire. It's warm." Just then, the curtain at the back of the eatery was lifted, and the waiter came in carrying a steaming bowl of porridge. Chapter 2, The Cold Winter Night. The still warm steamed bun tucked close to his chest provided a faint, comforting warmth. As the day drew to a close, the frigid winter evening was gradually descending. At that moment, Ethan Blake's gaze caught sight of a solitary mountain shrine in the distance. The small shrine was dilapidated, its wooden doors creaking unpleasantly in the bitter wind. The red-painted walls were chipped and cracked, revealing large fissures that failed to keep the cold air at bay. A faint light seeped through the gaps, lending a fragile sense of life to the otherwise desolate shrine. Upon seeing this sight, Ethan Blake's determined eyes lit up with hope. He tightened his coat around him, as though trying to preserve the warmth of the steamed bun and slow its cooling. "Mother!" Ethan whispered as his steps quickened slightly. But the snow was too deep, and his small frame struggled against it. Each step he took left a deep imprint in the snow, making it impossible for him to move faster. As he approached the crumbling shrine, the wooden door suddenly groaned and swung open in the icy wind. A frail figure slowly emerged. It was a woman in her 30s, her complexion pale, her eyes vacant, and her hair disheveled. Though her face was smudged with dirt, it could not hide the elegance of her delicate brows. Upon closer inspection, she exuded a fragile, ethereal beauty, hinting that she might once have been a stunningly beautiful woman. The woman leaned against the doorframe, her body trembling in the cold wind. Her clothing was no better than the shrine itself, worn and tattered, offering little protection against the harsh weather. "Ethan!" The woman saw the small figure of Ethan Blake in the snowstorm, and trembled as she called out softly. Yet, even that single call seemed to drain all her strength. Her dry, cracked, and purplish lips quivered, but she could not utter another word. "Mother, why did you come outside?" Ethan Blake shouted as he saw her open the temple door, his steps quickening instinctively. But his short legs, in their haste, slipped, and he fell into the snow. His small body sank deep into the thick layer of snow, and a few snow-white buns tumbled out from his arms, rolling far away and leaving a long trail behind. "Oh no, the buns!" Ethan Blake immediately scrambled to his feet. But after taking just one step, he fell again. This time, he didn't get up but instead rolled and crawled toward the buns, his small, reddened hands from the cold picking them up one by one. Holding the buns high above his head, he beamed and said joyfully, "Mother, look! I brought buns back. You don't have to go hungry anymore." The scene before her made the woman's eyes fill with tears, which spilled uncontrollably down her cheeks. She raised her hand to cover her mouth and sobbed softly. Ethan Blake trudged through the snow with difficulty, reaching the temple door. He held the buns out in front of her, his bright eyes shining as he said, "Mother, you must be very hungry. Please eat the buns. The beautiful woman quickly wiped her tears, bent down, and hugged Ethan Blake tightly to her chest, gently calling, "Ethan! Mother, it's so cold outside. Let's go back in," Ethan Blake said, rubbing his small head against the woman's chin. The woman let out a soft gasp and hurriedly carried Ethan Blake inside the temple, closing the old wooden door behind them. The door barely kept out the biting wind. "Mother, you're so weak. Let me walk on my own," Ethan Blake said obediently, noticing how tired she looked as she held him. "No. I like holding my Ethan Blake," the woman insisted stubbornly. She let out a long sigh, her steps shaky as she moved further into the temple. Her uneven gait revealed a clear disability in one of her legs. Inside the mountain god temple, a small fire had been lit with dry, withered branches, providing some warmth against the cold. The mother and son sat by the fire, its flickering light casting shadows on their pale faces. Despite her hunger, the woman only took small bites of the bun, chewing slowly and carefully before swallowing. She asked gently, "Ethan, are you sure you've eaten enough?" "Yes. I'm so full. Not just white buns, but I also had white rice porridge and pickled vegetables," Ethan Blake said, patting his stomach. The woman nodded and didn't press further. She tore the bun into small pieces and ate them slowly. "Mother, drink some hot water," Ethan Blake said. On the fire, a small, handleless iron pot was boiling water. He poured half a bowl of hot water into a chipped porcelain bowl, blew on it to cool it slightly, and handed it to her. The woman felt a sting in her nose, and tears almost fell again. She took a deep breath to suppress her emotions and said hoarsely, "Ethan, I failed you." "Mother, why would you say that? Taking care of you is the right thing to do. Why would you say you failed me?" Ethan Blake tilted his head, looking at her curiously. Every time he brought food home, she would say this. It was so strange. The woman gently wiped away the tear at the corner of her eye, sighing silently in her heart. There were words she could never say to a child only 7 or 8 years old. After thinking for a moment, she finally spoke. "Ethan, the Taoist gave you a steamed bun. Do you still remember what he looked like? Ethan Blake, holding a branch and poking at the fire, responded without hesitation. Of course I remember. He once said that even if someone grants you a drop of kindness, you must repay it with a fountain of gratitude. I remember everyone who has given us food. I even bowed to him 3 times. Good. Ethan, during the hardest times, the kindness others show us must always be remembered. When you succeed in the future, you must repay them. Doing good for others is also doing good for yourself. The woman earnestly taught Ethan Blake, reminding him as she always did. Hearing this, Ethan Blake nodded firmly. I will remember it in my heart, he said, though his thoughts wandered. That Taoist didn't even have a name, nor did they know where he came from or where he went. Would there ever be a chance to meet him again? While he still had some lingering questions, Ethan Blake carefully etched the word, snow, into his mind. This character is called Mother, which means your mother, the beautiful woman explained, pointing to the character that followed. Oh, so my mother's name is Margaret Snow, Ethan Blake exclaimed, clapping his hands with glee. His demeanor was completely different from the timid, cautious boy begging outside. In front of his mother, he was just an innocent child, basking in her love. But once he stepped out of this dilapidated temple, he would have to shoulder the responsibilities of a man with his small shoulders. Taking care of his disabled mother was a belief deeply rooted in his heart. Margaret Snow. Margaret Snow softly repeated her name, finding it both unfamiliar and familiar. The flickering firelight reflected in her eyes, making them shine brightly, as if they held countless memories, some sweet, others unbearably painful. Ethan Blake, after all, was still a child, and could not discern the complex emotions in Margaret Snow's eyes. He was engrossed in using the dry branch to practice writing those 2 characters repeatedly. He wanted to engrave his mother's name deeply into his memory. Outside the temple, the wind and snow grew fiercer. The icy wind, sharp as a blade, relentlessly cut into the temple's crumbling walls, causing aged plaster to fall and land with muffled thuds onto the thick snow. The mother and son inside had long grown accustomed to such sounds. After finishing his practice, Ethan Blake fell asleep in Margaret Snow's arms. The day had been overwhelmingly exhausting for him. Only in his dreams could he enjoy a life of warmth and abundance under a cozy roof. Margaret Snow gently caressed Ethan Blake's small face, the bruises still visible. Her heart ached as she sighed softly to herself. Ethan, I shouldn't have brought you with me. If you had stayed with him, you wouldn't have to suffer, wouldn't have to endure such pain. As she finished speaking, tears rolled down her cheeks uncontrollably. The night was pitch black, the cold wind sharp as knives, and the snow fell thickly from the sky. In the dilapidated temple, mother and son clung to each other for warmth, shutting out the world outside. By the 5th watch, the fire had died out, and the freezing cold began to seep through the temple. Dressed in thin clothing, the mother and son could no longer withstand the bone-chilling cold and woke up at the same time. Mother, I'll go restart the fire, Ethan Blake said reluctantly as he left his mother's embrace. He set out to find some dry branches and withered grass to rekindle the flames. Let me go, Mother. It's okay, Ethan. Your mother's legs are not convenient. Let me go instead, Ethan Blake said, waving his hand slightly, a hint of surprise in his heart. Every time he was beaten, his entire body would ache. But this time, he felt nothing. Even the cold bruises on his body seemed to have disappeared after a single sleep, revealing tender, rosy skin. Although puzzled, he didn't dwell on it. He gathered some firewood that had been collected earlier and rekindled the fire. The flickering flames brought warmth back to the dilapidated temple. Ethan, go to sleep. Let me watch the fire. I won't let it go out, Margaret Snow said, watching Ethan Blake busy himself. Her heart ached for him. Chapter 3. The Taoist. Ethan Blake, could it be wolves? Ethan Blake's face was filled with fear. He wasn't afraid of the cold or hunger, but the wolves that came out to hunt during the winter were not something he could contend with. While begging along the roads, he often heard adults say that during heavy snow seasons like this, wolves unable to find food would invade towns, steal poultry, and even attack lone travelers at night, especially in abandoned temples, which were known to be frequented by wolves. Margaret Snow was equally frightened and hurriedly said, "Ethan, come here to me. Wolves are afraid of fire." Ethan Blake immediately nestled into Margaret Snow's arms, his eyes still fixed on the temple door, fearing that a ferocious, drooling wolf might suddenly burst in. After a long while, a noise came from outside the door, the sound of something moving through the snow. Then, the decrepit temple door creaked unpleasantly as it was pushed open. For a moment, the mother and son tensed up, their entire bodies trembling. Fortunately, no wolf barged in. Instead, it was a Taoist priest clad in a deep blue robe and wearing a five-peaked hat. However, the priest did not enter. He only pushed the door open and then collapsed at the entrance, motionless. "It's a Taoist priest!" Ethan Blake let out a sigh of relief. As long as it wasn't a wild beast, he had nothing to fear. For someone who had begged on the streets and seen death multiple times, this was not a horrifying sight. Margaret Snow, her face pale, tugged at Ethan Blake's sleeve and said, "Ethan, don't go over there. It's fine. Let me check," Ethan Blake said, patting Margaret Snow's hand like an adult trying to reassure her. He then strode forward. When he was a few steps away from the priest, he stopped and called out loudly, "Hey! Are you all right?" Cough, cough. The priest seemed to regain some breath. Hearing someone call out, he coughed a few times and tried to gather his strength to get up but failed. Instead, he crawled further into the temple and, in a hoarse voice, said, "Kid, close the door. It's freezing." "Ah!" Hearing the priest's voice, Ethan Blake exclaimed softly, and quickly ran over to shut the temple door. Then he blew warm air onto his hands and looked at the priest, saying, "Taoist priest, it's you." The priest was taken aback. Struggling to lift his head, he looked at Ethan Blake and forced a faint smile. "Heh, this little one, we truly are fated to meet. What happened to you?" Ethan Blake grabbed one of the priest's arms to help him up. Seeing black streaks of energy swirling across the priest's face and blood at the corners of his mouth, he couldn't help but ask curiously, "It's nothing, just a minor injury." The priest waved it off. Within moments, his breathing became steadier. From a distance, Margaret Snow observed the priest regaining consciousness and speaking with Ethan Blake. After pondering for a moment, she seemed to recognize who the priest was. Her fear subsided, and she got up, limping toward the door. Together with Ethan Blake, she helped the priest up and guided him to the fire. "Thank you, kind lady." The Taoist sat cross-legged by the fire, feeling much warmer now. He clasped his hands together and spoke to Margaret Snow. "No need for such courtesy, Taoist. We should be the ones thanking you for your generosity in sharing food." Margaret Snow replied with a gentle smile. Ethan Blake, standing beside them, observed their conversation quietly, not daring to interrupt. "Ha ha, it's just a small matter. This little one is quite adorable." The Taoist began to speak further, but suddenly broke into a violent cough, the dark aura on his face growing even denser. "Damn it! The heavenly death smoke from the cycle of soul's order is truly potent," the Taoist muttered with a frown. He reached into his robe, pulling out a jade bottle, and poured out a few pills. Without hesitation, he swallowed them all at once. Instantly, a white mist began to rise from his body, enveloping him completely. Ethan Blake gaped in astonishment at the sight. He couldn't fathom how a person could emit so much white mist, which even seemed to gather and linger around him. Margaret Snow, on the other hand, furrowed her brows slightly, thinking to herself, "Could this Taoist be a spiritual cultivator?" The thought of those 3 words, spiritual cultivator, stirred an uneasy feeling in her heart. The white mist around the Taoist persisted for a full quarter of an hour before gradually dissipating, revealing his figure. The dark aura on his face had noticeably faded. "You?" The Taoist exhaled a deep breath of foul air, opened his eyes, and looked at the mother and son before him. A flicker of unease flashed in his gaze. Margaret Snow immediately felt a cold chill rise from her feet. She hastily pulled Ethan Blake into her arms and said to the Taoist, "Master, we are merely a widow and her child. Tonight we saw nothing, heard nothing. Please spare us." "Huh?" "Mother, the Taoist is not a bad person. He won't harm us," Ethan Blake said innocently, unaware of the tension between the adults. He found his mother's words somewhat strange. Margaret Snow's expression shifted repeatedly, but she didn't respond to Ethan Blake. Instead, she looked at the Taoist with pleading eyes. "Ha ha." The Taoist suddenly burst into laughter, his gaze fixed on Ethan Blake as he carefully examined the boy. After a moment of contemplation, he stroked his chin and beckoned to Ethan Blake. "Come here, young one." "No!" Margaret Snow cried out helplessly, holding Ethan Blake tightly and refusing to let go. "Lady, rest assured, I will not harm him. I am Charles Green, a Taoist from Ethereal Hall. I was ambushed by enemies and poisoned, which is why I must remain cautious. Just now, I noticed your unusual expression and feared it might be a trap set by my pursuers," Charles Green explained upon seeing Margaret Snow's terrified expression and her maternal instinct to protect her child. Margaret Snow breathed a sigh of relief, hesitating for a moment about whether to release Ethan Blake. But the boy, unaware of the situation, wriggled free from his mother's grip and walked up to Charles Green. Blinking curiously, he asked, "Taoist uncle, what is Ethereal Hall? Do all the people there emit white mist like you?" "Ha ha." Charles Green laughed heartily, patting Ethan Blake on the head. "If I told you, it might scare you. Taoists from Ethereal Hall can not only emit white mist, but also wield countless magical powers, controlling ice, fire, thunder, and wind, summoning storms, flying through the air, and even riding swords to strike enemies from miles away. Some of the most powerful Taoists can even shatter the void and ascend to immortality. What do you think? Impressive, isn't it?" Ethan Blake listened in awe, imagining what it would be like to fly in the sky, summon storms, and control elements like ice and fire. Margaret Snow, standing nearby, furrowed her brows even deeper. It seemed the term, spiritual cultivator, was something she deeply dreaded. "Here, young one, take this pill," Charles Green suddenly said, extending his hand toward Ethan Blake. In his palm lay a small white pill that trembled slightly, emitting a fragrant medicinal aroma into the air. "Ethan, do not eat it!" Margaret Snow shouted sternly, rushing forward to pull Ethan Blake back. But to her shock, she found herself immobilized by an inexplicable force, unable to move a single step. "Elder sister-in-law, this pill smells so fragrant." Ethan Blake's eyes shimmered with a hint of fascination as he gazed at the pill in Charles Green's hand. He then turned to look at Margaret Snow, whose face was filled with worry, his expression wavering with hesitation. "Consume this elixir, and you can undergo a transformation, gaining the aptitude to become a cultivator. It will also allow you to assist me in my endeavors," Charles Green said, his tone laced with an eerie chuckle as he glanced at Margaret Snow with a sinister smile. "Ethan, absolutely do not eat it," Margaret Snow cried weakly. Already frail and barely able to stand, her anxiety for Ethan Blake seemed to push her to the brink of collapse. If not for her concern for him, she might have fainted already. Yet at this moment, Ethan Blake appeared to hear nothing. The scent of the pill seemed to possess a magical allure, captivating his young mind. Words like, flying through the heavens, sword riding, and becoming an immortal, combined with the teachings his elder sister-in-law had instilled in him about standing out in life, began to converge in his thoughts. Deep within his heart, a voice filled with longing echoed, "Eat it! Eat it!" Unable to resist the compelling call of that mysterious power, Ethan Blake reached out, took the pill from Charles Green's hand, and slowly brought it to his mouth. Boom! Instantly, he felt his entire body suffused with a wondrous force. The pill melted the moment it touched his tongue, transforming into a gentle stream that seeped into his internal organs. An indescribable sense of comfort enveloped him. Ah! Ethan Blake let out a soft groan of pleasure, his face flushing red as if intoxicated. His body swayed unsteadily before collapsing to the ground with a thud. "My child! Give my child back to me!" Margaret Snow screamed, her voice filled with anguish, like a lioness driven mad. In that instant, her frailty and disability seemed to vanish. Charles Green said nothing, pulling out a square jade pendant and a thin book, which he tucked into Ethan Blake's chest. He then turned to Margaret Snow and said, "Elder sister-in-law, this matter is of utmost importance. I had no choice but to resort to extraordinary measures. This boy has just consumed the Genesis elixir, altering his constitution. What the future holds will depend on his destiny. I have imprinted my intentions into his mind and placed a restriction on him. Once he fulfills my grand objective in the future, the restriction will naturally dissolve. My child!" Margaret Snow seemed unable to hear anything, her cries echoing as she struggled desperately against the force restraining her, yet to no avail. "Sigh." Charles Green sighed deeply, casting a glance at the unconscious Ethan Blake. He appeared as though he wanted to say something but ultimately remained silent. With another heavy sigh, he looked toward the temple's entrance and murmured to himself, "They've arrived so quickly. It seems I, Charles Green, can no longer return to Ethereal Hall." With that, he suddenly waved his hand, unleashing a massive palm strike against the crumbling temple wall. Boom! The wall shattered, sending debris flying everywhere. A large hole appeared, allowing the icy wind to rush into the temple. "Elder sister-in-law, forgive me," Charles Green said softly before flicking his fingers. A streak of energy shot forth, striking Margaret Snow's heart. Her body shuddered, and she instantly fell unconscious. Charles Green cast one final glance at Ethan Blake before his figure flickered and vanished through the hole in the wall. With a few leaps, he disappeared into the snowy night. Not long after Charles Green's departure, several dark-clad figures descended outside the ruined temple. Noticing the drag marks in the snow leading to the temple's entrance, they exchanged glances before turning their attention toward the temple. Chapter 4 Murder. Junior brothers, Charles Green is full of cunning schemes. We must all be cautious. The 6 men dressed in black stood together. The one who spoke had a deep and commanding voice, clearly the leader among them. "Senior brother, we understand." The others nodded, carefully advancing toward the temple door. The senior brother took a deep breath and suddenly struck a powerful punch, shattering the temple door into splinters that flew in all directions. "Charles Green is not here." The remaining 5, equally agile, leaped inside along with the flying debris. Inside the humble mountain god temple lay a mother and child unconscious on the ground, with no trace of Charles Green. "Senior brother, this child seems to have an issue. It looks like he consumed some kind of pill, couldn't withstand its potency, and died." One of the men in black examined Ethan Blake's faint breathing and reported to the senior brother. "Just a beggar child. Charles Green probably used him to test medicine, trying to cure the heavenly doom poison. Another scoffed coldly, crouching down to inspect Margaret Snow. Upon seeing her face, he couldn't help but be startled, silently lamenting. What a pity for such a beauty! He escaped through here. Another man in black pointed to a hole in the wall and called out. Let's pursue him, the senior brother commanded, and the group quickly leaped through the hole. A trail of footprints stretched into the distance, suggesting Charles Green had fled in that direction. Without hesitation, they chased after him. William Ford, stay here at the temple. Junior Sister Moore will arrive tomorrow morning. Assist her, the senior brother instructed the man who had just inspected Margaret Snow before hastily leaving. Senior brother is always so considerate, William Ford sneered, walking over to the dying fire to warm himself. However, the dilapidated temple, with its broken door and a large hole in the wall, allowed the cold wind to blow in incessantly. The small fire provided little warmth. I thought I could warm up here, but it's freezing. If I wait until morning, I'll surely freeze to death, William Ford muttered, standing up and looking around. His eyes lit up when he noticed the altar of the mountain god. He immediately ran over, drew his dagger, and chopped the altar into 5 or 6 pieces. After some measurement, he decided it was enough to patch up the hole in the wall. After a while of busy work, William Ford had repaired the wall, filling the gaps with bricks and stones, finally blocking out the cold wind. As for the main door, he took an even simpler approach, tearing down the curtains from both sides of the mountain god statue, nailing them to the door, and wedging stones underneath to seal it tightly. Much warmer now. William Ford returned to the fire, added dry branches, and stoked the flames higher. Those 2 unlucky souls wasted lives, he remarked, glancing at the mother and child lying on the ground. Shaking his head, he walked over to Margaret Snow, squatted down, and carefully observed her. This beggar girl, so beautiful, what a waste, he murmured. Unable to resist, he reached out to touch Margaret Snow's face, finding her skin still slightly elastic and warm. Seems like she hasn't been dead for long. That wicked priest, how heartless! To kill such a beauty without a second thought. William Ford shook his head. Though he expressed regret with his words, his face betrayed a look of disdain. Turning to glance at Ethan Blake beside him, he noticed the boy's thin face flushed red and glistening. Muttering to himself, William said, What kind of elixir has this kid been fed? After speaking, he abandoned Margaret Snow and stepped toward Ethan Blake, observing him carefully. Suddenly, a thought struck him, and his eyes gleamed with excitement. Could it be that Charles Green gave this boy the Genesis elixir? He murmured to himself. The idea sent a surge of joy through William's heart. He thought, This frail boy's weak body can't withstand the potent effects of the divine elixir. How fortunate for me! Once I drink his blood and refine the elixir's power, my body will undoubtedly become even stronger. The more he thought about it, the more elated William became. The Genesis elixir from Ethereal Hall was an exclusive secret medicine, capable of transforming the body, purging impurities, and laying a solid foundation for cultivation. Such an elixir was a rarity in the world, and yet today, fortune had delivered such an opportunity to him. Heaven truly favors me, William exclaimed with a laugh. Grabbing Ethan Blake's arm, he opened his mouth, ready to bite into the boy's wrist. Let go of my son! A sudden voice rang out from behind him. Startled, William froze, unable to turn around before a gust of wind swept toward the back of his neck. Instinctively, he raised his hand to block the attack. Pain shot through him, igniting his anger. Without looking, he lashed out with a powerful kick, sending the assailant flying into the opposite wall. As it turned out, just as William was about to drain Ethan's blood, Margaret Snow regained consciousness. Seeing the horrifying scene before her, she was filled with terror. Without hesitation, She grabbed a dry wooden branch as thick as her arm and struck William with all her strength. Margaret coughed up blood, sweetness rising in her throat. Struggling to get up from the ground, she found herself too weak to move. "You dare to attack me?" William's fury erupted. Showing no mercy, he leapt toward Margaret and stomped down hard on her chest. With just a bit of pressure, the sound of breaking bones echoed. "Don't hurt my son!" Margaret's voice was broken and weak from the overwhelming pain, yet her thoughts remained on Ethan Blake. "Mother!" Ethan, having consumed the Genesis elixir, was overwhelmed by its effects due to his frail body and had fainted. After a long while, he slowly regained consciousness. Opening his eyes, he saw an unfamiliar man stepping on his mother's chest, his face twisted with malice. His mother's face was pale, her chest soaked in blood, clearly gravely injured. Rage surged within Ethan as he called out, "Mother!" and charged forward. Despite being only 7 or 8 years old, thin and frail, barely reaching William's waist, Ethan lunged at him, grabbing his leg and biting down without hesitation. "Damn it!" Even through the thick cotton fabric of his pants, William felt a sharp pain. Cursing, he turned and lifted Ethan off his leg, a sinister grin spreading across his face. "You little brat, you dare bite me? Fine. Let's settle this now." With that, he dragged Ethan to his side and opened his mouth, ready to sink his teeth into the boy's neck. It should be noted that William Ford wasn't inherently a cruel person. However, as an outer disciple of the Cycle of Souls order, he was looked down upon. Not only was his aptitude poor, but he was also lazy. If it weren't for a relative in the inner sect shielding him, he would have been expelled long ago. Now, with the potent Genesis elixir coursing through Ethan Blake's blood, an elixir so rare and valuable, how could William not lose his mind? By refining this elixir, he could transform his body, gain the opportunity to join the inner sect of the Cycle of Souls order, and become a true disciple, finally escaping the disdain and ridicule of others. Just as William Ford's fangs were about to sink into Ethan Blake's neck, Margaret Snow, who had been writhing in pain to the point of unconsciousness, suddenly unleashed an astonishing burst of strength. Her entire body sprang up, clinging onto William Ford's back, and she bit down hard on his ear. The ear, already delicate, was savagely bitten by the frenzied Margaret Snow. William Ford cried out in agony, repeatedly screaming as he threw Ethan Blake to the ground. Twisting his body, he grabbed Margaret Snow by her hair, attempting to pull her off. But Margaret Snow, protecting her son like a mad woman, seemed impervious to pain. Her slender neck stretched as she bit off a piece of William Ford's ear. "You filthy wench, I'll kill you!" William Ford roared in both pain and fury. With a violent yank, he tore out a chunk of Margaret Snow's hair, along with a piece of her scalp. The searing pain jolted Margaret Snow back to consciousness, and she instinctively reached up to touch her head. Taking advantage of the moment, William Ford shoved her away and kicked her hard, sending her flying. As he looked at the severed ear in her mouth, rage consumed him like wildfire. "You vile woman, give me back my ear!" William Ford stormed toward Margaret Snow, intent on retrieving the ear from her mouth. But at that moment, an unexpected turn of events unfolded. A sudden icy sensation pierced his waist, followed by an excruciating pain that seemed to drain the very life from him. "Ah!" William Ford let out a startled cry and turned his head. He saw Ethan Blake, his eyes bloodshot, standing coldly with a sharp knife in his hand, its blade still dripping with blood. "Where did the knife come from?" The thought flashed through William Ford's mind as he instinctively reached for his waist, realizing his own dagger had disappeared. "I'll kill you!" William Ford snarled through clenched teeth, twisting his body and landing a powerful punch on Ethan Blake's head. The boy was sent flying across the room. "Ethan!" Margaret Snow, barely clinging to life, cried out weakly. Summoning the last of her strength, she lunged at William Ford, knocking him down. The two began to wrestle fiercely. William Ford, already gravely wounded from the stab to his waist, bled profusely during this struggle. It took every ounce of his strength to pin Margaret Snow beneath him, panting heavily. Margaret Snow's clothes had been torn to shreds in the scuffle, revealing her frail body. On her pale legs, near her knees, two horrifying scars stood out starkly. "You filthy woman, I'll kill you!" William Ford's eyes burned with fury as he pinned Margaret Snow down, raising his fist to strike her. Thud! Another knife plunged in, this time straight through his heart. William Ford's raised fist froze midair, his entire body going rigid as terror filled his eyes. Ethan Blake's small hand slowly withdrew from the knife's hilt. As he moved, William Ford collapsed, twitching only a few times before falling lifeless. "Mother!" Ethan Blake wailed, throwing himself into Margaret Snow's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Chapter 5, Separation. "Ethan!" Margaret Snow reached out, gently stroking Ethan Blake's head, her movements feeble and frail. "Mother, let me find some clothes for you." Ethan Blake noticed his mother was nearly unclothed and felt uneasy, immediately wanting to find something to cover her. "Ethan, don't go." Margaret Snow grasped Ethan Blake's arm tightly, her face pale to a terrifying degree, even her lips devoid of color. "Talk to me, my child." "Mother, you'll feel cold like this." Tears glistened in Ethan Blake's eyes. Though just a child, he could sense the gravity of the situation. "Ethan, listen to me." Margaret Snow took a deep breath before continuing. "I fear I won't make it. I won't be able to stay by your side anymore. You must take care of yourself, survive, grow strong, and live an honorable life in the future." Margaret Snow spoke in a long, drawn-out breath, her gaze becoming increasingly unfocused, the signs of life slipping away rapidly. "I don't want that. I want you to stay with me, Mother. I'll find lots of delicious food for you. When I grow up and earn money, I'll make sure you never go hungry or cold again." Ethan Blake sobbed uncontrollably. Despite his young age, he understood what death meant. "Silly child, everyone must face death someday. Don't be sad. Live well, so I can rest peacefully in the afterlife," Margaret Snow said weakly. She then pointed toward the statue of the mountain god, struggling to speak. "Under the statue, there's a longevity locket. Take it, go to the Grand Capital, the Blake estate, find Richard Blake, he—" Margaret Snow's voice grew fainter and fainter. She repeated the word, he, several times before falling silent. "Mother!" Ethan Blake could no longer suppress the anguish in his heart. He called out to her, but his cries soon turned into silent sobbing. From this moment on, he would never again see his mother smile, never again learn to read with her, and never again have anyone to share his small triumphs with, like bringing home a steamed bun. Death meant eternal separation. Ethan Blake's cries echoed through the temple, resounding in the pitch-black snowy night, reverberating in the cold, desolate world. Yet, no one could truly understand the torment this small heart was enduring. From this moment forward, he was utterly alone, left to face the world on his own. Hoo! Ethan cried for a long time before his sobs gradually subsided. Looking at his mother's tattered clothing, his heart ached. Searching around, he found no other garments. In the end, he stripped the black outer robe from William Ford, dressing Margaret Snow in it as a makeshift cover. At the same time, he took the short knife still strapped to William Ford's back. Boo! Ethan Blake exhaled deeply, his gaze dark and somber. William Ford had acted mercilessly, and ever since Margaret Snow had been kicked in the chest by him, her life had been hanging by a thread. Everything she did after that came purely from a mother's instinct to protect her child. Beneath the deity's statue, Ethan Blake found the longevity locket Margaret Snow had mentioned. He toyed with it in his hand for a while, but found nothing special about it, so he hung it around his neck. After thinking for a moment, the boy rummaged through William Ford's clothes and found a small gourd, just the size of his palm. When he shook it lightly, a jingling sound came from inside, though he had no idea what it contained. Without the mood to investigate further, he tied it to his belt. On William Ford, there were only a few small pieces of silver, which Ethan Blake also took. Once he was prepared, Ethan Blake used all his strength to drag William Ford's body out of the ruined temple and threw it into the snow, muttering under his breath, "I absolutely cannot let Mother be buried alongside this scum." Looking up at the sky, where heavy snow continued to fall, a sense of bewilderment flickered in Ethan Blake's young eyes. No matter how he thought about it, he couldn't believe that so much had happened in just one short night. He had lost the person he loved most. A wave of sorrow surged within him as he returned to the temple. At this point, Margaret Snow lay still on the ground, as if in a deep sleep. Quietly, Ethan knelt in front of her, bowed his head 3 times with great force, then stood up. He found some lamp oil near the deity's statue, poured it over Margaret Snow's body, and gently set it alight using a burning piece of wood from the fire. Watching Margaret Snow's body gradually consumed by flames, Ethan Blake's gaze grew resolute. He softly said, "Mother, I promise I will succeed." With that, the boy decisively turned away, poured the remaining lamp oil throughout the temple, set it ablaze, and walked out of the dilapidated mountain god temple, a place that held so many memories for him. The mountain god temple, primarily made of wood and soaked in lamp oil, caught fire instantly. In the blink of an eye, flames roared, illuminating the surroundings and melting the nearby snow. The first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. The earth, dormant through the long night, slowly awakened. In this endless snowy night, so many tales of joy and sorrow had unfolded, yet no one paid attention, no one cared. No matter who perished, the world continued its course. The mountain god temple had turned into a heap of ruins, with only the naked body of William Ford lying in the snow-covered ground. At this moment, a group of more than 10 figures approached, stepping through the dawn's light. Upon closer inspection, they were young women clad in red, each with graceful figures and beautiful features, all around 17 or 18 years old. In just a few breaths, these young women in red reached the mountain god temple. Seeing the charred remains, they couldn't help but frown. "Oh my!" One young woman gasped in surprise upon spotting William Ford's naked body, quickly covering her eyes. "What's so shocking about that?" An older girl scolded. "Senior Sister Moore, he's not wearing any clothes. It's so embarrassing." The startled young woman dared not look in that direction, turning her face away and pointing at William Ford's corpse. Senior Sister Moore froze, her brows furrowing as she glanced over. Sure enough, a naked man lay on the snowy ground. She quickly turned her head away. Scanning the group of junior sisters, her gaze finally rested on a slightly plump young woman. "Chu Yin, go check if that man is dead. Why does he look familiar to me?" All of them were young girls, who had never encountered such a situation before. Just talking about it made their faces blush. Chu Yin, reluctant but intimidated by Senior Sister Moore's stern glare, shrank back and reluctantly stepped forward. She dared not look at the sensitive areas and instead focused on William Ford's face for a moment before stammering. "Senior Sister Moore, this is William Ford from the Cycle of Souls Order. He's dead." "Oh." Senior Sister Moore raised her eyebrows, glancing back briefly. It was indeed William Ford from the Cycle of Souls Order. "How did he die? Let me take a closer look." Chu Yin thought to herself that since she had already seen it, there was no point in avoiding it any longer. She approached cautiously and carefully examined William Ford's body. Senior Sister Moore, he was stabbed to death. One wound at the waist, another at the back. Humph. This man died here without a shred of clothing on him. He must have been up to no good and got ambushed. A cold-faced young woman huffed, her tone revealing a deep grudge against William Ford. Senior Sister Moore furrowed her brows, carefully observing the surroundings. After pondering for a moment, she reached into her chest and pulled out a small paper kite, no bigger than her palm. Muttering a few words under her breath, her slender finger lightly tapped the kite, which immediately transformed into a streak of light and flew away. "Senior Sister, there are footprints over here," called out a young woman who was investigating the area on the other side. Senior Sister Moore moved swiftly to her side. On the thick snow, a trail of tiny footprints stretched into the distance, a look of astonishment flashing in her eyes. "Why are they children's footprints? Could it be that a child killed William Ford?" Senior Sister Moore murmured. The young woman who had discovered the footprints spoke softly. "Could it be a high-level expert from some sect, deliberately leaving these to mislead us? Perhaps they intend to use this opportunity to sow discord between us and the Cycle of Souls order?" "Oh!" Senior Sister Moore raised an eyebrow, looking at the young woman in front of her. A flicker of surprise crossed her gaze, but she said nothing and flew back, leaving the young woman standing there in a daze. "Chu Yin, clear a spot for us to rest. We'll wait here for Senior Brother Carter from the Cycle of Souls order to return." Although William Ford was merely an outer disciple of the Cycle of Souls order, he came here to assist us. His death is unclear, and we can't just leave like this, Senior Sister Moore instructed, making no mention of the footprints. Instead, she directed Chu Yin to prepare a cleared area for them to rest. Chu Yin looked reluctant but knew better than to provoke Senior Sister Moore. Begrudgingly, she went to find a spot with less snow. Taking a deep breath, her cheeks puffed up. "Phew!" In an instant, a strong gust of wind blew from her mouth, clearing away all the snow and revealing a wide, open patch of ground. "Junior Sister Chu, your gale roar spell is becoming more refined," one of the young women remarked as Senior Sister Moore led the others to the cleared area. Her tone carried no flattery, only a hint of mockery. Chu Yin paid no attention, lowering her head, as a flash of malice glinted in her eyes. These young women each had their own skills, and somehow, they had managed to produce over a dozen meditation cushions. They spread them out on the ground, sat cross-legged, and waited for Senior Brother Carter from the Cycle of Souls order to arrive. "Senior Sister, do you think Senior Brother Carter can handle that demonic cultivator?" A young girl sitting next to Senior Sister Moore asked softly. Senior Sister Moore furrowed her brows, pondered for a moment, and then replied, "That Charles Green not only possesses profound magical powers, but is also extremely cunning. I fear that with just Senior Brother Carter's strength, it will be very difficult to deal with him. However, Charles Green has been afflicted by the heavenly fiend poison mist of the Cycle of Souls order, so the outcome is unpredictable. What if Senior Brother Carter kills Charles Green, and that item falls into the hands of the Cycle of Souls order? Wouldn't all our efforts be in vain?" Another young girl questioned. "Rest assured, the Cycle of Souls order wouldn't dare to take that item for themselves. Moreover, over the past century, our two factions have cooperated many times and maintained mutual trust. With the growing power of virtue keep suppressing other sects, the Cycle of Souls order wouldn't be foolish enough to turn against us," Senior Sister Moore said calmly. Chu Yin, sitting at the far end, scoffed inwardly, thinking, "Wishful thinking. Who doesn't know that item holds an earth-shattering secret? Any sect that obtains it could rise to dominance. These fools, all of them are so naive." Naturally, the others couldn't guess Chu Yin's thoughts, and continued their whispered discussions. However, their conversation gradually veered off topic, eventually turning to debating which disciple of the Cycle of Souls order was the strongest and who was the most handsome. In my opinion, none of the disciples from the Cycle of Souls order are worth mentioning. Among the sects of the 6 northern nations, only Henry Brooks of Virtue Keep is truly outstanding, a peerless talent. Senior Sister more suddenly interjected, seeing the heated debate. Instantly, the others gave her peculiar looks. Her face turned red, and she closed her eyes, beginning to meditate. Oh! The group suddenly seemed to realize something. After a long while, Senior Brother Carter of the Cycle of Souls order appeared in the distance, accompanied by 2 men in black. From afar, he called out, "Junior Sister Lillian, apologies, we are late." Chapter 6, Icefield. Junior Sister Lillian, these footprints are tiny, clearly those of a child. What do you think? Senior Brother Carter of the Cycle of Souls order hurried back upon receiving the message via paper crane. Hearing the news of William Ford's murder, his brows furrowed deeply as he surveyed the surroundings before asking in a low voice. It turned out that the Senior Sister Moore's full name was Lillian Moore. She raised an eyebrow slightly, thought for a moment, and replied, "The world is vast, and strange occurrences are countless, especially in our realm of cultivation, where extraordinary individuals abound. It's likely just some expert cultivating a peculiar technique." Senior Brother Carter nodded, narrowing his eyes, as he studied the small footprints for a while before instructing 2 fellow disciples. "Xingji, Yen Quan, you 2 take Junior Brother William's body back to the Cycle of Souls order and report everything here to Elder Elliot Walker. I will follow these footprints to track down whoever this expert is." The 2 disciples, named Xingji and Yen Quan, respectfully acknowledged the order with serious expressions. They carefully arranged William Ford's body and then flew off. Once they were gone, Senior Brother Carter turned to Lillian Moore and said, "Junior Sister Lillian, that Charles Green is incredibly cunning. We pursued him all night without finding a trace. However, he's been poisoned by our Cycle of Souls order's heavenly death toxin and won't last much longer. I've already sent Junior Brothers Nathan Miller and Chris Harrison to monitor him and informed our branch halls. He won't escape easily." Lillian Moore exhaled lightly and said, "If that's the case, I'll send someone to assist the Junior Brothers. Meanwhile, I'll notify other fellow disciples to provide support. We must retrieve the item in that demonic cultivator's possession." "Heh." Senior Brother Carter sneered after hearing this. "Junior Sister Lillian, are you afraid we'll monopolize the item? Senior Brother Carter, you're overthinking it. For 100 years, our Cycle of Souls order and Heartforged Fellowship have handled countless matters together as one family. How could I possibly harbor any doubts about you? Charles Green is highly skilled in the arcane arts. I'm merely concerned that Junior Brothers Nathan Miller and Chris Harrison might struggle to handle him." With that, she gestured toward the 10 young women behind her. Take 9 junior sisters with you to assist." "Yes, Senior Sister." The young woman named and the others responded in unison. They executed their movement techniques and headed in the direction of Senior Brother Carter, resembling butterflies dancing across the snowy landscape. Senior Brother Carter's expression darkened slightly, but he said nothing, merely remarking, "Very well. Junior Sister Lillian, I will go track down the owner of these footprints. Senior Brother Carter, I wish to accompany you," Lillian Moore said with a smile, unfazed by the trace of dissatisfaction on his face. Senior Brother Carter grunted, though inwardly he thought resentfully, "This sly little vixen, I'll teach her a lesson someday." Setting aside the internal strife between the disciples of the Cycle of Souls order and Heartforged Fellowship, the story shifts to Ethan Blake, who had left the Mountain God Temple and was heading north at dawn. Although young, Ethan Blake had spent years navigating the bustling cities and had some knowledge of the world. The capital, mentioned by Margaret Snow, referred to the capital of Wu Kingdom, one of the 6 northern nations, located at the farthest northern reaches of the extreme north. Ethan Blake, however, was currently in Icefield Kingdom, another of the 6 northern nations, separated by 3,000 miles of snow and ice from Wu Kingdom's capital. Between the two nations lay a vast expanse of frozen wilderness. Even for an adult with a carriage, the journey would take 2 to 3 months, assuming there were no snowstorms. Yet, such hardships and dangers were beyond young Ethan Blake's comprehension. The sudden death of his mother had left him lost and adrift, with only one thought in his mind: to follow his mother's final instructions, reach the capital, and find someone named Richard Blake. There, he would seek protection until he was grown, achieve success, and fulfill his mother's last wishes. The icy wind cut to the bone, and snow fell heavily. Ethan Blake tightened his coat around him, his footsteps resolute as he pressed forward. In the white expanse of the world, his small footprints stretched endlessly into the distance. Strange, why does my chest feel warm? Ethan Blake was a bit puzzled. He had long developed a deep awareness of the cold, yet at this moment, something felt peculiar in his heart. His thin clothing should not have been able to resist such freezing temperatures. However, it seemed as though a fierce flame was burning in his chest, driving away the biting chill and leaving warmth coursing through his body. Ah! Ethan exhaled a breath, gazing at the vast snowy plain ahead. He pushed aside the doubts in his heart and murmured softly, "Mother, Ethan will surely live well and achieve great things." Clack, clack. Just then, behind Ethan Blake, a horse-drawn carriage suddenly emerged faintly through the snowstorm. The sound of a whip cracking in the air echoed as the driver urged the horses forward. Ethan quickly stepped aside, moving out of the way to avoid being hit by the carriage. Creak. The wheels grated against the snow, producing a sharp, unpleasant sound as the carriage approached closer. "What a beautiful carriage," Ethan remarked. The carriage was drawn by 4 majestic red horses, its body made of black ebony wood, intricately carved and exuding luxury. Sitting atop the carriage was a middle-aged man dressed in green attire, his thin lips tightly pressed together, his expression cold. The whip in his hand snapped crisply in the air with a mere flick of his wrist, urging the horses to gallop through the snow. "The driver is quite skilled. He doesn't even need to swing his arm to crack the whip. He's far better than old Master Sun," Ethan muttered in admiration as he observed. While Ethan was curiously watching the scene, the carriage suddenly stopped not far from him. "Uncle David Miller, go see what's going on with that child. Why is he out here alone in such heavy snow?" A tender voice called from inside the carriage. "Yes, young lady," David Miller responded. Without any visible movement, he leaped off the carriage, landing in front of Ethan Blake in the blink of an eye. "Hey, kid, why are you walking alone on this snowy plain?" David Miller asked, his face expressionless and his tone stiff. Ethan frowned but didn't reply, silently continuing to walk. Seeing the luxurious carriage, he immediately assumed it belonged to a wealthy family. As someone who had begged for food everywhere, he naturally harbored a sense of resentment toward the rich. "Hey kid, I'm talking to you." David Miller raised his voice when Ethan ignored him. The boy, however, acted as though he hadn't heard, keeping his head down and moving forward. "Kid!" David Miller grew irritated. With a slight movement, he appeared in front of Ethan, grabbed him by the collar, and barked. "Are you deaf?" Ethan felt his clothes tighten as his feet left the ground. Hearing the question, he shouted back, "You're the one who's deaf. So you can talk after all," David Miller remarked, releasing Ethan. Once freed, Ethan adjusted his thin clothing, glancing at the carriage with disdain. He still remembered the time he had begged at a wealthy household, only to be beaten by their servants. His heart had long been filled with hatred for such people. Ethan withdrew his gaze and continued walking, ignoring the man entirely. David Miller pressed his lips together and narrowed his eyes, but didn't pursue the boy further. Instead, he returned to the carriage and respectfully said, "Young lady, that child is strange. Let's not concern ourselves with him and continue on our way. This child is wearing thin clothing and walking alone on this snowy plain. It's truly pitiful. Uncle Miller, could you ask him where he's heading? If it's along our route, we can give him a ride and spare him from the cold." The girl inside the carriage spoke, seemingly unaware of David Miller's earlier words. "My lady, we should refrain from meddling in others' affairs and focus on reaching our destination on time," David Miller replied, standing motionless, his tone as stiff as ever. Swish. The thick cotton curtain of the carriage was drawn aside, revealing a stunningly beautiful girl of about 14 or 15 years old. She cast a slightly annoyed glance at David Miller. "David Miller, when the young lady asks you to do something, you just do it. Why so much talk? Miss Emma Watson, before we left, the Duke specifically instructed me to ensure the young lady's safety and not to interfere in others' matters." David Miller responded, his face as expressionless as if it were carved from stone. "Humph." Emma Watson scrunched her delicate nose and glared at him before turning back to address the person inside the carriage. "Young lady, I'll go take a look." "Go ahead," the girl inside the carriage replied. Emma Watson hopped down from the carriage and quickly caught up to Ethan Blake, her breath slightly labored as she called out, "Hey kid, wait up. Where are you heading? My lady would like to offer you a ride." Hearing the gentle voice behind him, Ethan Blake hesitated for a moment before turning around. Seeing that the speaker was a stunningly beautiful young woman with a kind tone, far different from the cold demeanor of the man earlier, he softly replied, "Thank you, sister, but I can manage on my own." Emma Watson chuckled at his response. "What a little man you are, talking like an adult. But out here in this icy wilderness, who knows when you'll reach the next town? It's better if you come with us." Without waiting for Ethan Blake's reply, she took his small hand in hers and led him toward the carriage. Emma Watson's hand was soft and warm. Feeling her touch, Ethan Blake's heart trembled slightly. It reminded him so much of his mother's hand. Instinctively, he didn't resist and allowed her to lead him to the carriage. "Hurry and get in," the girl inside the carriage urged impatiently. Emma Watson lifted the curtain for Ethan Blake, helping him inside, and then instructed David Miller to continue their journey. Inside the carriage, it was remarkably spacious. At the center was a brazier, its glowing coals radiating warmth throughout the space. Beside the brazier sat a girl around Ethan Blake's age, doll-like in appearance, dressed in a pale goose-colored outfit. She smiled warmly at Ethan Blake. "Come, sit down and warm yourself," she said enthusiastically, showing none of the haughty demeanor one might expect from a noble young lady. Chapter 7, Pursuit. Inside the carriage, it was as warm as spring, completely isolated from the biting cold outside. 3 people sat around a heater. Miss Emma Watson took out various candies and placed them on a small table beside her. The 3 of them ate and chatted. "My name is Sophia Blake, and you?" The little girl, noticing Ethan Blake's shyness, spoke up first. "Ethan Blake." Ethan mumbled, his hands not stopping, as he grabbed another piece of candy and devoured it hungrily. Seeing Ethan's way of eating, Miss Emma Watson frowned, intending to say something, but when the little girl named Sophia Blake wrinkled her nose at her, she smiled instead and stoked the embers in the heater. "Ethan Blake, where are you headed?" Sophia Blake asked with a playful smile. Ethan swallowed the candy, savoring its sweetness, and replied, "The Grand Capital." After all, he was just a child. Despite harboring some resentment toward the wealthy, the fact that the other party was a child around his age made him feel more at ease, and he spoke without much reservation. "The Grand Capital?" Both girls were stunned. Sophia Blake exclaimed, "The Grand Capital is very far away. Are you just going to walk there?" Ethan nodded. The 3,000-mile distance was a concept too vast for his young mind to grasp. He only knew it was very far. Sophia wanted to say more, but Miss Emma Watson nudged her and then spoke up. "You're so young. What are you going to the Grand Capital for? Where is your family?" At the mention of family, Ethan immediately fell silent, a glimmer of sadness flashing in his eyes. He thought to himself, "I cannot cry. I must be strong." Resolving this, he rubbed his eyes, suppressing the sorrow that arose when he thought of his mother. Seeing Ethan's silence and slightly gloomy expression, Miss Emma Watson gave him a thoughtful look before changing the subject. "In another 60 or 70 miles, we'll reach Moonlight Hollow. Shall we rest there, young lady?" "That sounds great. Riding in the carriage is so boring." Sophia Blake clapped her hands in agreement. At that moment, the neighing of horses suddenly rang out from outside. The carriage shook violently before coming to a halt. Simultaneously, David Miller's voice called out, "Everyone, why are you blocking our way?" The three inside the carriage were startled by the sudden jolt. Miss Emma Watson's face turned cold as she lifted the curtain and asked, "David Miller, what's going on?" "Miss Emma Watson, these people are blocking our path." By now, David Miller had jumped down from the carriage, single-handedly controlling the reins of the 4 frightened horses. Through the curtain, Ethan Blake could only see a man dressed in black blocking the carriage. Behind him stood 5 or 6 young women in pink attire. "Black robes?" As Ethan's gaze fell on the man, his heart skipped a beat. The man's black outfit was identical to the one worn by someone he had killed. "The accomplices of that villain have caught up." Ethan instinctively shrank back, his eyes filled with fear. The man in black, noticing a young woman with bright eyes and white teeth stepping halfway out of the carriage and scolding the driver, assumed she was the owner of the carriage and spoke up. "Pardon me for the intrusion, young lady." Miss Emma Watson, only partially leaning out, coldly asked, "Why are you blocking our way? Do you know whose carriage this is?" Seeing the luxurious carriage and Miss Emma Watson's beauty, the group assumed she had an impressive background. The man then said, "Apologies for the abruptness, young lady. Along the way, have you encountered any child behaving suspiciously?" Miss Emma Watson frowned, her eyes glinting as she thought, "Could Ethan Blake be hiding something? Sister Watson, who is it out there?" Ethan Blake's heart raced upon hearing the mention of a child, fearing that Miss Emma Watson might expose him. If he fell into their hands, he would surely die. Sitting next to him, Sophia Blake glanced at Ethan before standing up. She poked her small head out of the carriage door and asked in a clear, ringing voice, "They asked if we had seen any suspicious children." Miss Emma Watson, seeing her master had already taken the lead, hesitated for a moment, debating whether to mention Ethan Blake or not. This spared her from making the decision herself. "What child?" "Someone like me." Sophia Blake blinked her large, adorable eyes, her face full of curiosity. Spotting another little girl in the carriage, porcelain doll-like in appearance, they couldn't confirm if she was the one they were searching for and hesitated. At this moment, someone tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "Look at the crest on the carriage roof. It's the emblem of the Blake family from Wu Kingdom. We should be cautious." "Oh!" He immediately looked up at the roof and indeed saw a strange floral pattern engraved there, causing him to feel secretly alarmed. Miss Emma Watson noticed everything, smirked coldly, and said, "Any more questions? We're in a hurry. Please step aside." He frowned, glanced at them, and moved aside. "Humph." Miss Emma Watson snorted coldly, and turned to Sophia Blake. "Miss, it's cold outside. Please get inside." Then she addressed David Miller, who was standing guard by the carriage. "Let's go!" Without a word, David Miller leapt onto the carriage, cracked the whip with a loud snap, and the 4 fine horses neighed sharply, galloping away. Behind them, only a flurry of white snow remained, swirling in the air. "Sister, why did you let them go so easily? I think they might be responsible," a young girl muttered as she watched the carriage disappear into the distance. "Don't speak nonsense. The Blake family of the Grand Capital isn't someone we, as mere outer disciples, can afford to offend," she immediately scolded. The young girl shrank back in fear, causing another nearby to smirk coldly. The Blake family of the Grand Capital wielded immense power. Years ago, they had made great contributions to Wu Kingdom, shaking the 6 northern nations. Moreover, behind the Blake family stood the leader of the 10 demonic sects. The immortal and demonic factions alike, with their 10 sects and 10 schools, cultivated their own forces in the mortal realm. These forces intertwined, restrained one another, and provided endless manpower and resources for these sects and schools. The world's resources belonged to them. Watching the reprimanded girl, she thought to herself, "These foxy women, aside from their flattery and coquettishness, have no real skills. They'll never be my competition in the future." With that thought, she glanced over again, her mind turning. "She's the obstacle standing in my way to entering the inner sect. Sooner or later, I'll have to deal with her." With a grim expression, she said in a low voice, "If it really was the Blake family who killed them, this matter won't be simple. Junior sister, let's follow them. When they stop at the next town, we'll investigate quietly. What do you think? I have no objections." She smiled, her eyes flashing with a subtle cunning that no one noticed. No one could guess what she was planning. After their discussion, the group followed the carriage tracks, slowly trailing behind the Blake family's vehicle. The snowy roads were difficult to traverse, and even the carriage couldn't move very fast. After traveling for 4 or 5 hours, an ancient town gradually came into view. David Miller cracked the whip and called out loudly, "Miss, up ahead is Moonlight Hollow." Inside the carriage, the 3 passengers were dozing in the warm cabin. Ethan Blake, in particular, was exhausted and snoring softly. Hearing David Miller's call, he jolted awake, looked around the cabin in confusion, and then sighed in relief. Sophia Blake and Miss Emma Watson also stirred, their eyes lighting up with joy. Miss Emma Watson lifted the curtain and asked, "David Miller, are they still following us?" "Yes." David Miller nodded, his face expressionless. "Humph." Miss Emma Watson snorted coldly. "Those fools, with only a bit of cultivation, dare to tail me. Truly reckless. If it weren't for protecting the young." "Lady, I'd have gone back and killed them myself." David Miller said nothing, simply lowered his head and drove the carriage. Lady Emma Watson shrank back into the carriage, glanced at Ethan Blake, and said, "Kid, you're not the one they're looking for, are you?" Ethan Blake froze, about to retort, but Sophia Blake interjected, "Sister Watson, have they been following us all this time?" "Indeed. But don't worry, m'lady, they're just ordinary folks. They can't do anything to us." Lady Emma Watson replied somewhat helplessly. It was clear she was covering for Ethan Blake, but there wasn't much else she could do. Ethan Blake looked at Sophia Blake with gratitude in his eyes, then lowered his head, staring intently at the burning embers in the fireplace without saying a word. Moonlight Hollow wasn't large, with an estimated 400 to 500 households, none of which were farmers. Instead, they were all merchants. The main reason for this was that Moonlight Hollow was located at a critical transportation hub, frequented by countless merchants traveling north and south. Many stopped to rest here, and over time, some open shops selling rare and exotic items, attracting quite a crowd. The Blake family's carriage entered Moonlight Hollow and headed straight to the largest inn in town, called Seafarers' Haven Inn. Despite the heavy snowfall, Seafarers' Haven Inn still bustled with merchants coming and going. A sharp-eyed doorman spotted the approaching carriage and immediately came forward with a cheerful smile, saying, "Isn't this Steward Miller? What brings you out in such heavy snow?" It was clear that David Miller was a regular here. "Cut the chatter, Tommy Brown. My lady wishes to rest here for a day. Go make the arrangements," David Miller replied familiarly, pulling out a silver ingot from his pocket and tossing it to the doorman. "Right away," Tommy Brown responded cheerfully, quickly taking the reins from David Miller and leading the carriage to the inn's entrance. "My lady, Lady Emma Watson, we've arrived," David Miller said respectfully. "Got it," Lady Emma Watson replied, stepping out first and holding up the curtain for Sophia Blake and Ethan Blake to exit the carriage. Once everyone had disembarked, Tommy Brown called into the inn, and another attendant promptly came out to invite the group of four inside. Meanwhile, Tommy Brown led the carriage around to the inn's backyard. In a diagonal alley across from Seafarers' Haven Inn, several individuals observed the Blake family's every move. "So, there's another child hidden in the carriage," Senior Brother Carter murmured softly. He fixed his gaze on Ethan Blake's back and said, "That child has items belonging to Junior Brother Wang. The dagger at his waist and that small gourd are both Wang's possessions. If he didn't kill him, then he definitely knows something. Then tonight, we'll quietly investigate," someone suggested. "Agreed," Carter replied. Chapter 8, The Night. The three members of the Blake family, along with Ethan Blake, entered the Seafarers' Haven Inn. Familiar with the place, David Miller booked 2 premium rooms, led everyone upstairs, and instructed the attendant to prepare a lavish feast. Once everything was ready, the four of them sat around the table in the room, listening to David Miller introduce Moonlight Hollow. Moonlight Hollow lies on a crucial trade route, accessible from all directions. Heading north for 3,000 miles leads to the capital city of Tuking in the Wu Kingdom. To the west is the Brightvale Kingdom, and to the east is the Eastwind Dominion. Although situated within the Icefield Kingdom, it is an essential passageway for merchants from various nations. Covered in snow year-round, the region still sees traders braving the icy terrain, driven by profit not only to exchange goods, but also to gather news from all over. David Miller spoke without much expression, and the other three quickly grew bored. Ethan Blake and Sophia Blake, both only 10 years old, showed no interest in the topic. Even David himself found it dull and, after a few sentences, lowered his head to sip his tea in silence. Noticing his awkwardness, Sophia Blake giggled and said, "Sister Watson, tell us about your virtue keep again." Lady Emma Watson took a sip of tea and smiled. "How many times have I told you already? You still want to hear it? Hee, I just love hearing it." Sophia Blake immediately clung to Lady Emma Watson's arm, shaking it playfully. All right, you win," Lady Emma Watson said affectionately before clearing her throat. "Virtue Keep is the leader of the 10 sects. It has 100,000 disciples, and our sect master, Supreme Immortal Master, has reached the battle rotation stage of the Undying Realm, a peerless cultivation level." Her eyes sparkled as she spoke. Since being pursued by the cycle of Soul's Order, Ethan Blake had been restless. He barely responded to questions and kept replaying the events of the previous night in his mind, his heart aching. However, when Lady Emma Watson mentioned Virtue Keep, his eyes brightened, and he leaned in to listen attentively. "Little one, when you're older, I'll take you to Virtue Keep to cultivate. Once you become an inner disciple, the sect will take care of you, and even your family will benefit," Lady Emma Watson said, sharing stories about virtue keep, how senior disciples had reached various cultivation stages, could fly on swords, and traverse the skies effortlessly. Sophia Blake listened in awe. When Lady Emma Watson paused to rest, she eagerly asked, "Sister Watson, if I go to cultivate, does that mean I'll be able to fly too?" "Of course," Lady Emma Watson replied, playfully tapping Sophia's nose with her delicate finger. It was then she noticed Ethan Blake listening intently. Her heart stirred, and she thought to herself, "Could this child know about virtue keep? Does he have some hidden background? That must be it. Otherwise, why would the Cycle of Souls Order be after him?" Thinking of this, Miss Emma Watson cleared her throat and said, "Ethan Blake, do you also know virtue keep?" Ethan Blake, who had been listening to her, was startled by this sudden question. His entire body stiffened, and his face showed confusion as he replied, "Never heard of it." "Oh." Miss Emma Watson observed Ethan Blake closely. Seeing that he didn't seem to be pretending, her curiosity grew stronger. She pressed further. "Then what have you heard of?" "Ethereal Hall, Charles Green," Ethan Blake blurted out without hesitation. The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them. Lowering his head, his heart raced with anxiety. "Ethereal Hall?" Miss Emma Watson was taken aback. She turned to David Miller and said in a serious tone, "This child cannot stay with us. David Miller, drive him out." Hearing the words, "Ethereal Hall," David Miller's expression also changed. He nodded, stood up, grabbed Ethan Blake, and said coldly, "Kid, so you're connected to Ethereal Hall. No wonder the Cycle of Souls Order is after you." With that, he dragged Ethan Blake toward the door. Just as he was about to push it open, Sophia Blake suddenly burst into tears. She clung to Miss Emma Watson's hand, crying, "You can't kick Ethan Blake out, Miss!" David Miller and Miss Emma Watson exclaimed in unison, "No! Let him go now, or I'll tell my father that you bullied me on the road," Sophia Blake said cleverly, crying loudly as she spoke. "Miss Emma Watson." David Miller hesitated. Miss Emma Watson glared at Ethan Blake, frowning. "Fine, let him stay for now. Once I've calmed the young lady, we'll deal with this later. And the Cycle of Souls Order," David Miller began. "Humph. What about the Cycle of Souls Order? Do you think I'm afraid of them?" Miss Emma Watson quickly embraced Sophia Blake, whispering a few words to her. Sophia Blake immediately stopped crying, jumped out of Miss Emma Watson's arms, and ran to David Miller. She turned to Ethan Blake and asked, "Kid, what exactly is your connection to Ethereal Hall? Sister Watson said if you tell us, we won't make things difficult for you." Ethan Blake opened his mouth, but didn't know where to begin. In the end, he mumbled, "I know a Taoist named Charles Green. He gave me a few buns. That's all?" Sophia Blake widened her eyes in surprise. Ethan Blake nodded. What he said wasn't exactly a lie. He had simply omitted many details. Sophia Blake, being young, didn't think too much about it. She ran back to Miss Emma Watson and said, "Sister Watson, you heard him. Don't make things hard for him anymore." Miss Emma Watson took a deep breath, gestured for David Miller to release Ethan Blake, and said, "Miss, tomorrow we'll stay here for a day before continuing our journey. He's not traveling the same path as us. Let him stay with us tonight. As for tomorrow..." Sophia Blake appeared somber as she tugged on Ethan Blake's hand. "Ethan Blake, I'm sorry. After all, our paths are not the same. Today, eat as much as you can. Later, I'll ask Uncle Miller to buy you a padded coat. Your clothes look too thin." Hearing this, Ethan Blake felt a lump in his throat and held back tears. "Thank you. For a drop of kindness, I must repay with a stream. If I succeed in the future, I will surely repay you." The two children spoke seriously, like adults, which was quite amusing and eased the tense atmosphere in the room. At that moment, several attendants knocked on the door and entered, carrying wine and food. After receiving their tips, they left cheerfully. All four, hungry from the journey, said little and sat down to eat their fill. Ethan Blake, who had been begging for food since childhood, had never tasted such delicious dishes before. He temporarily forgot the unpleasant events earlier and focused on eating to his heart's content. The group arrived at Moonlight Hollow by late afternoon. After their hearty meal, the evening gradually set in, and it was time to light the lamps. Emma Watson and Sophia Blake shared a room, while David Miller and Ethan Blake stayed together, each settling in for rest. As night fell, the once bustling Moonlight Hollow quieted down. The attendants of the Seafarers' Haven Inn, exhausted from a busy day, finished their chores, returned to their quarters, bathed, turned off the lights, and went to bed early. In the dead of night, only the sound of the icy wind tearing through the air could be heard, producing a sharp, eerie howl. Two swift figures suddenly emerged in the darkness. It seemed they had planned this beforehand, as they leapt directly onto the roof of the Seafarers' Haven Inn. With a few agile jumps, they landed in the inner courtyard and headed straight toward a premium guest room. Their movements were light as snowflakes, leaving no trace on the snow and making no sound upon landing. The premium room they approached belonged to Ethan Blake and David Miller, where the occasional sound of snoring could still be heard. Reaching the window, one of them pulled out a bamboo tube, gently pierced the paper window, inserted it, and blew softly. A faint wisp of smoke drifted into the room. Moments later, all sounds inside ceased. The person whispered, "It's done. Junior Sister Lillian, you keep watch here. I'll go in and tie up the child." These two were none other than Daniel Carter and Lillian Moore. Lillian Moore nodded. "Be careful. The Blake family has virtue. Keep backing them. If we offend them, there will be dire consequences." Daniel Carter nodded in agreement, then carefully pushed the door open and slipped inside. Lillian furrowed her brows, scanning her surroundings. Seeing everything was quiet, she exhaled softly, thinking to herself, "Daniel Carter is cunning and full of schemes. I must always remain vigilant around him." Just as this thought crossed her mind, a muffled noise came from the room, followed by the sound of fists and feet clashing fiercely. "Something's wrong," Lillian muttered anxiously, pushing the door open. Inside, two figures were locked in an intense fight in the shadows. On the bed in the corner of the room, a small figure huddled, too frightened to move. "Junior Sister, I'll hold him off. You take the child and leave," Daniel Carter shouted urgently. Lillian didn't respond. Instead, she darted to the bed, reached out, and grabbed the child. "Stay away!" Ethan Blake, who had been in a deep sleep, was startled awake by the commotion. He tried to sit up but felt weak all over, his head spinning. Seeing someone reach out toward him, he let out a feeble cry before being lifted up. A faint fragrance wafted into his nose as he thought, "So it's a woman!" Then, feeling his body sway as he was carried out of the room, the freezing wind hit him, and he passed out immediately. "Friend, we're only here for the child. Please step aside," Daniel Carter said as he fought David Miller. "Humph. You dare lay hands on a member of the Blake family? Aren't you afraid of virtue keeps retaliation?" David Miller, though highly skilled in martial arts, found himself evenly matched with Daniel Carter and was inwardly alarmed. Seeing another person enter and take Ethan Blake, he could only resort to invoking virtue keep to intimidate his opponent. "That's irrelevant now. This child is of great importance. Apologies in advance. Heavenly venom smoke." Daniel Carter, noticing that Lillian had succeeded, shouted loudly. With a flick of his wrist, a cloud of smoke rose in the darkness. Seizing the opportunity, he dashed out the door. "Ah, David Miller, ever cautious, recognized the mention of heavenly venom smoke and knew its danger. He quickly darted out the door, only to find Daniel Carter already leaping onto the roof. His figure resembled a soaring eagle as he disappeared into the night. The cold wind hit David, causing him to shiver and regain clarity. He realized the so-called venom smoke was merely a bluff, just a handful of flour. "Humph," David scoffed, deducing that his opponents wouldn't dare harm a member of the Blake family. Feeling slightly reassured, he turned and rushed towards Sophia Blake's room. While Ethan Blake's abduction was concerning, it was nothing compared to the consequences he would face if anything happened to the young lady of the house. Chapter 9, Tactics. Daniel Carter and Lillian Moore, one in front and one behind, sprinted out of Moonlight Hollow. Ethan Blake had been handed over to Daniel Carter, but the boy had been struck by a sedative and wouldn't wake up for a while. After running over 10 miles away from Moonlight Hollow, the two finally stopped, glancing back toward the town. It was pitch black, and it was clear that the Blake family members had not pursued them. "All right, let's rest here for a bit," Daniel Carter said with a sigh of relief, tossing Ethan Blake onto the snowy ground. Lillian Moore nodded, standing still to catch her breath. After a moment, she asked, "Senior Brother Carter, it seems like your sedative didn't work on that man, did it?" "Humph. I underestimated him," Daniel Carter replied. "His cultivation level is on par with mine, both at the transformation stage. In the secular world, he'd be considered a formidable master." Lillian Moore frowned. "This child looks about 7 or 8 years old. No matter how I look at him, he's just a little beggar. He doesn't seem capable of killing Senior Brother Wang." "Well?" Daniel Carter glanced at Ethan Blake lying on the ground. The boy's clothes were tattered, his body covered in scars, his face pale and emaciated, indeed the appearance of a true street urchin. Even Daniel began to waver in his own suspicions. "We'll question him once he wakes up," Daniel said, exhaling warm breath into the cold air. Squatting down, he rummaged through Ethan Blake's clothes, but only found a thin book. On its cover were the neatly written words Codex of Might, an introductory body refinement manual. He casually tossed it aside. Seeing Daniel Carter eagerly searching Ethan Blake's belongings, Lillian Moore couldn't help but ask, "Senior Brother Carter, what are you looking for?" Daniel Carter froze for a moment before replying, "Junior Sister Lillian, do you think I've already obtained the item from Charles Green and plan to secretly deliver it to the Cycle of Souls Order?" Lillian Moore was stunned. That was indeed what she had suspected. She hadn't expected Daniel Carter to bring it up so suddenly. She instinctively took 2 steps back, channeling energy throughout her body, wary of a potential sudden attack. "Haze!" Daniel Carter sighed bitterly. "Junior Sister Lillian, you're overthinking things. To be honest, last night we did capture Charles Green, but we found nothing on him. Then, due to a momentary lapse, he managed to escape. At the time, we speculated that Charles Green might have hidden the item." Daniel Carter paused before continuing. "We pressured Charles Green relentlessly, leaving him no time to act. The only opportunity he had was at that ruined mountain god temple. Among those there, the most suspicious were that mother and child." He pointed at Ethan Blake and added, "At that time, this boy's face was flushed red. Even though I only gave him a cursory check, I could tell he had consumed some kind of pill. Given his frail body, he couldn't possibly withstand its effects. Therefore, I suspect that thing might be hidden on this child by Charles Green." Lillian Moore nodded slightly. With Charles Green's personality, this is indeed possible. If it's not on the child, then we'll have to wait for him to wake up. The snowy night descended, and the temperature dropped even further. Daniel Carter and Lillian Moore, being cultivators with physiques different from ordinary people, naturally were not afraid of the cold. But Ethan Blake was different. Though under the influence of a sleeping drug, his body instinctively curled up from the cold. In less than half an hour, he groaned softly and woke up from his unconscious state. So cold. Ethan Blake, just regaining consciousness, blurted out these words, feeling as if his entire body had fallen into an icy abyss, with even his blood seemingly about to freeze. The only warm place was his chest, where it felt as though a fist-sized flame was burning fiercely, protecting his heart. As he awakened, that flame burned even more intensely, its scorching heat gradually spreading throughout his body. In an instant, he no longer felt the cold. The two people who had been keeping watch over Ethan Blake immediately turned their gaze toward him upon hearing his words. At the same time, they both exclaimed, "Huh?" They saw that Ethan Blake, whose body had been covered in snow, was now suddenly enveloped in a layer of white mist. That mist was formed by the snow on his body evaporating. "Something's definitely wrong," Lillian Moore exclaimed in shock. "It must be the medicinal power of the elixir that Charles Green had him consume. Let's wait and observe further." Daniel Carter replied calmly, "You won't have the chance." However, at that moment, an extremely chilling voice suddenly echoed from the darkness. Both Carter and Moore were startled and called out, "Who's there?" "Heh. Forgotten me so soon?" A young girl dressed in a purple brocade coat stepped out slowly from the shadows. With each step she took, the snow beneath her feet rapidly melted, revealing the dark ground beneath. "It's you." Daniel Carter's face turned grim. The girl who suddenly appeared was none other than Miss Emma Watson, who had been accompanying the eldest daughter of the Blake family. However, her expression now was as cold as frost, a stark contrast to her demeanor during the day. "You're quite bold, daring to snatch someone from Virtue Keep," Miss Emma Watson said coldly, her face emotionless. Around her, a faint layer of light seemed to emanate. Daniel Carter and Lillian Moore were inwardly alarmed. This Miss Emma Watson had secretly followed them here, and it was unclear how long she had been hiding in the shadows. Judging by their earlier conversation, it was likely she had overheard everything. Realizing this, the two exchanged glances and said in unison, "Since you pursued us, don't blame us for being impolite." With that, their figures moved simultaneously, launching an attack toward Miss Emma Watson. Seeking death. Miss Emma Watson let out a cold shout, raising her jade-like hand in midair. Immediately, a whirlwind erupted on the flat ground, sweeping up snow and hurling it toward the two attackers. "This isn't good. She's a nascent soul stage expert," Lillian Moore exclaimed in shock, twisting her slender waist to dodge midair, leaping to one side. Boom! Daniel Carter heard the warning sound and was about to step back, but it was too late. A whirlwind struck him directly, producing a dull thud as he was flung backward 2 or 3 zhang before crashing to the ground. Humph! Lady Emma Watson let out a cold snort. "A mere cultivator at the divine transformation stage dares to act arrogantly in front of me? My mood isn't great today. Both of you must die." Before her words had fully landed, she raised a finger midair, this time targeting Lillian Moore. The sound of wind slicing through the air could be heard as a transparent ice spear materialized and shot forward. Splat! Blood immediately spurted from Lillian Moore's shoulder. "Sigh! It seems my ice lance technique still isn't refined enough. I missed the mark." Lady Emma Watson shook her head repeatedly, clearly dissatisfied with her strike. Although the wound wasn't fatal, Lillian Moore's face darkened. She realized that even a casual attack from her opponent was something she couldn't evade, an overwhelming disparity in strength. Escaping death today seemed almost impossible. "Miss, we mean no harm. Truly, this child is tied to some secrets of our cycle of souls order. If we have offended you, I humbly ask for your forgiveness," Daniel Carter said loudly, getting up from the snow-covered ground in the distance and regaining his composure. "Heh, you're quite persistent," Lady Emma Watson sneered, her figure flickering as she appeared just 3 steps away from Daniel Carter. She completely ignored his words, raising her hand to strike again. At such close range, with Emma Watson's lightning-fast movements, Daniel Carter felt death looming over him. "Bullying 2 outer disciples. What skill is that?" Suddenly, a cold gust of wind surged between Lady Emma Watson and Daniel Carter. Daniel Carter's body was swept away by the wind, flung 4 or 5 zhong back, landing beside a slim young man who stood there with a look of disdain directed at Lady Emma Watson. Lady Emma Watson struck mist, and her expression changed slightly. She spoke coldly. "Who are you, to dare interfere in the matters of virtue keep?" The young man glanced at Lady Emma Watson and replied, "I naturally wouldn't dare meddle in Virtue Keep's affairs. But Daniel is my junior brother. If you want his life, do you think I should stand by and do nothing?" "Humph." Lady Emma Watson snorted coldly. "Then let's see if you have the ability to stop me." As she spoke, her hands trembled, causing the surrounding snow to rise into the air, melt into vapor midair, and then instantly freeze into long icicles over a meter in length, densely packed in a large formation. "Ice lance dance." Miss Emma Watson raised an eyebrow, and countless ice lances immediately shot out, dense like a rain of arrows. "Good," the young men praised, supporting Daniel Carter and moving him to a farther location. Then, his body began to spin rapidly. As his spinning speed increased, streams of light began to form. Swish, swish, swish. Countless ice lances collided with the streams of light, instantly shattering into icy fragments. "Got you!" The spinning young man shouted loudly as 3 black throwing knives shot out, forming a triangular formation, heading straight for Miss Emma Watson. The black throwing knives gleamed with a faint green light, clearly coated with poison. Miss Emma Watson, seeing her attack fail and the opponent's knives flying toward her, stepped aside, dodging 2 meters away. Before she could stabilize herself, she suddenly felt the hairs on her back stand on end. Alarmed, she bent her slender waist forward. 3 sharp gusts of wind swished past above her head. It was evidently the 3 throwing knives. The young man's knives could even track their target, truly formidable. "Ice lance technique." Miss Emma Watson, having narrowly avoided danger, grew furious. She pointed continuously in midair, and several more ice lances shot out immediately. "Heh! With just this trick you dare to show off?" The young man halted his spinning, suddenly opened his mouth, and spewed out a flame, burning all the incoming ice lances to ashes. "Very well." Miss Emma Watson took a deep breath, reached into her bosom, and retrieved a small sword about the size of her palm. The small sword radiated a golden glow, and as soon as it was drawn, faint golden lights shimmered in the air, with sharp sword energy emanating from it. "A sword talisman." The young man froze, his expression immediately turning extremely serious. A sword talisman is the condensed sword intent of a great cultivator, formed into a talisman in the shape of a sword. Once activated, its power is immense, far beyond what ordinary cultivators can withstand. "Good that you know." Miss Emma Watson slowly raised the sword talisman in her hand, and golden light surged forth. Streams of sword energy flowed like silk from her palm. With just a thought, these sword energies could be unleashed, and everyone present would be cut into pieces. "Humph! You're ruthless." The young man gritted his teeth and then turned to Daniel Carter, saying, "Junior brother Carter, forgive me. I cannot contend with a sword talisman. Farewell." With that, his figure flashed, and he fled. "Senior brother Andrew, don't leave me behind." Daniel Carter cried out in despair. Seeing that senior brother Andrew had disappeared, he looked at Miss Emma Watson with eyes full of fear. "Heh! Coward! Miss Emma Watson sneered, clenching her jade-like hand. Instantly, the sword energies dissipated without a trace, and the sword talisman was withdrawn. Though this treasure was powerful, it could only be used once, and was not easily obtained. Naturally, if it could be saved, it would not be wasted. Chapter 10, The Horror. She sheathed her sword talisman and took a step forward. The young woman surnamed Watson glided effortlessly to stand before Daniel Carter, sneering. So, the disciples of the Cycle of Souls order are all the type to abandon their comrades. Today, my horizons have truly been broadened. Daniel Carter, resigned to his fate, let the despair on his face fade away. Instead, he snorted coldly. Enough with the chatter. Do it. Oh, still angry, are we? Miss Watson raised an eyebrow. Her right hand slowly lifted, and a translucent ice shard coalesced at the tip of her jade-like finger, aiming straight for Daniel Carter's heart. The chilling aura emanating from it made Daniel shiver. He thought to himself, this ice shard will likely pierce my heart in the next second. All the years of arduous training wasted. With that thought, he closed his eyes. Whoosh! At that moment, from behind Miss Watson, a pitch-black blade aura suddenly tore through the air. Ah! Miss Watson sensed something amiss, and tilted her body to the right, attempting to dodge. But it was too late. A sharp pain and numbness shot through her left arm. Damn it! Without even looking back, Miss Watson swung her right hand, sending the ice shard she had just formed flying behind her. Ha! A fledgling like you wants to fight me. Don't think that just because you're a disciple of Virtue Keep, I wouldn't dare touch you. Andrew, the senior brother, who had earlier fled, stepped out from the shadows. With a casual wave of his hand, he deflected the incoming ice shard. Humph! Miss Watson snorted coldly, reaching into her chest to retrieve her sword talisman once more. Andrew, however, sneered. You've already been poisoned by my blade. I'd advise you not to act rashly. While the sword talisman is powerful, it requires vital energy to activate. The moment you channel your vital energy, the poison will take effect immediately. Not even a celestial deity descending could save you. If you're smart, you'll focus on finding a way to detoxify yourself. The movements of Miss Watson immediately stopped, her expression shifting. Just as the other party had said, in just a moment, the numbness from her wound had begun to spread. Frowning, Miss Watson took out a porcelain bottle, opened the lid, swallowed all the pills inside, glanced at senior brother Andrew, and then said, I'll remember this debt. I'll repay it double in the future. I'll be waiting. Senior brother Andrew shrugged, his face full of disdain. Hey! Where are you running off to? At this moment, the injured Lillian Moore suddenly shouted loudly. Everyone turned to look and saw that Ethan Blake, who had been curled up on the ground earlier, suddenly leaped up and bolted into the distance. Lillian Moore's figure moved instantly, chasing after him. Ethan Blake, small and short-legged, had only run a few meters before Lillian Moore was about to catch him. At that moment, Miss Watson suddenly sprang into action, her body moving like lightning as she shot forward and struck Lillian Moore on the back. Thud! Lillian Moore, who was charging ahead, was suddenly ambushed. Her body staggered and fell to the ground, rolling a distance away. Before she could get up, she felt a sweetness in her throat and spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. In the blink of an eye, the small Ethan Blake was grabbed by Miss Watson, who dashed away at lightning speed. Senior brother Andrew, we can't let them escape. Ethan Blake was very important. No one had expected that Miss Watson, despite being poisoned, would suddenly act, snatch Ethan Blake, and flee. Daniel Carter couldn't help but shout in alarm. Senior brother Andrew, however, didn't budge. He calmly said, Junior brother, this woman has some tricks up her sleeve. If we corner her, she might risk her life and unleash her sword talisman. None of us would make it out alive. Sigh. Daniel Carter sighed deeply, filled with regret, but there was nothing he could do. Miss Watson carried Ethan Blake and ran for over 10 miles, heading away from Moonlight Hollow. Let me go, MMPH! Ethan Blake tried to shout, but a cold gust of wind rushed into his mouth, nearly choking him. He had woken up from unconsciousness, and hadn't even had time to stand when he saw Miss Watson suddenly appear. Witnessing the entire scene of the fight, he was so terrified that he didn't dare move. It wasn't until Miss Watson was ambushed and everyone's attention was focused on her that he suddenly jumped up, attempting to escape. Regardless of whose hands he fell into, the outcome wouldn't be favorable. As for Daniel Carter's group, it went without saying. And Miss Watson, who had long disliked him, would have likely driven him away if not for Sophia Blake. Cough, cough. Kid, you'd better behave yourself, Miss Watson said coldly, her breath slightly labored after running such a distance. She slowed her pace. After running another 4 or 5 miles, a pine forest appeared ahead. The swaying shadows of the trees obscured its vastness. Without hesitation, Miss Watson dashed into the forest. Deep inside, she found a clearing and finally stopped. Breathing a sigh of relief, she threw Ethan Blake to the ground, ignoring him, and sat cross-legged on the ground, closing her eyes to meditate. Ethan Blake rubbed his sore backside, got up, and, seeing that Miss Watson wasn't paying attention to him, darted his eyes around and started to sneak away. Humph. You'd better stay put. If you move, you'll regret it, Miss Watson suddenly said, as if she had anticipated his intentions. Ethan Blake froze, startled. He quickly stood still, not daring to move. What are you holding in your hand? Miss Watson's voice rang out again. Nothing, just a book, Ethan Blake stammered, realizing that when he had fled earlier, he had conveniently picked up the Codex of Might that Daniel Carter had dropped. He wasn't well versed in reading, and had no idea what the Codex of Might was. However, upon leaving the mountain god temple, he discovered the book in his possession. Flipping through it briefly, he saw only a few words and some strange movements illustrated inside. Guessing that Charles Green might have slipped it to him for some purpose, he decided to keep it safe. Hand it over. Miss Watson's eyes snapped open, her complexion slightly pale, and her voice grew even colder. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but seeing her stern expression, his heart pounded. Reluctantly, he stepped forward cautiously, and handed the Codex of Might to her. Miss Watson glanced at the book in his hand, furrowing her brows as she asked, Where did you get this? Ethan was about to say that Charles Green gave it to him, but he quickly reconsidered. He absolutely couldn't reveal that. Instead, he said, I picked it up off the ground while running earlier. Oh. Miss Watson pondered for a moment, nodded, and chose not to expose Ethan's lie. She continued, Now tell me, what did Charles Green give you? Where are you hiding it? He didn't give me anything. Ethan tried to deny it, but seeing Miss Watson's piercing gaze that felt like a blade, he panicked. After stammering for a while, he finally admitted. He gave me a pill, something called the Genesis Elixir, and this book. Genesis Elixir? Miss Watson's eyes lit up. She immediately grabbed Ethan's wrist and gently examined him before bursting into laughter. Ha ha, my luck is truly incredible. Ha ha! With the effects of this Genesis Elixir, even the deadliest poison is nothing. Seeing Miss Watson suddenly laugh maniacally, her expression twisted and menacing, Ethan's heart sank. Especially when he heard her mention the word effects, he knew something was wrong. He recalled the mountain god temple, where the burly man had worn a similar expression. Let me go! Let me go! Ethan shouted in panic, struggling desperately to free himself from Miss Watson's grasp. However, Miss Watson's hand was like an iron clamp, gripping his wrist tightly, making it impossible to break free.
Let you go. If I let you go, I'll die,
Miss Watson said coldly. That numbing sensation, as she darted away like the wind, had already begun spreading from her arm to the left side of her body. If it weren't for her using a secret antidote to suppress the poison, she might have been done for by now. As she spoke, Miss Watson grabbed Ethan Blake's hand, rolled up his sleeve, and slightly parted her cherry lips, preparing to bite down.
Help!
Ethan Blake cried out in terror. The woman who, during the day, was gentle as water and doting on Sophia Blake, now seemed no different from a demon. She actually wanted to drink his blood. How could he not be horrified?
Stop moving!
Ethan Blake struggled his arm, but Miss Watson failed multiple times to succeed. Furious, she applied force, and with a crack, broke Ethan Blake's wrist.
Ah!
Ethan Blake screamed in pain, bursting into tears, his whole body convulsing from the agony. Miss Watson opened her mouth and bit down hard. However, as her teeth touched Ethan Blake's skin, her entire body began to tremble. A sharp pain surged from the wound on her arm straight to her heart.
Ah!
With a cry of pain, Miss Watson fell backward. In an instant, her face was covered in a dark aura, her expression twisted in agony, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her grip on Ethan Blake's arm loosened immediately. Ethan Blake, consumed by pain and terror, stared blankly at Miss Watson for a fleeting moment before spinning around and fleeing the pine forest.
Huff! Huff!
Even from a distance, the guttural noises from Miss Watson's throat echoed in his ears, blending with the swaying shadows of the trees that loomed like specters. Fear coursed through him, numbing the agony of his fractured wrist as he stumbled and scrambled to get away. The snowstorm raged violently, the wind howling with an eerie shriek that sent chills down his spine. Ethan staggered out of the forest, disoriented in the pitch-black night, running blindly with reckless desperation. All he wanted was to put as much distance as possible between himself and the nightmare he had just endured. The horrors of the night had pushed him to his limit, his voice trembling as he cried out,
Are all these adults insane? Are they even human? Mom, Ethan is so scared.
He had no sense of how far he had run. All he knew was that his pace was slowing, his legs growing heavier with each step, as though shackled by invisible weights. Finally, his strength gave out. Thud. He collapsed to the ground, rolling slightly before coming to a halt, unable to rise again.
Mom! Mom!
Ethan sobbed, his surroundings spinning as his consciousness began to fade. In his mind's eye, the image of Margaret Snow emerged, her arms slowly opening to him in a tender, welcoming gesture. Her voice, soft and soothing, reached him.
My Ethan! My Ethan! Mom!
Tears streamed down his face as his vision blurred further. Yet, amidst the biting cold, a warmth enveloped him, as though he were cradled in Margaret Snow's loving embrace.
It's so warm in Mom's arms,
he thought, a faint smile spreading across his face as his eyelids grew heavy. The snowstorm outside roared with even greater ferocity. #### Chapter 11. White Bear. The surroundings were pitch black, so dark that even stretching out his hand, Ethan Blake couldn't see his 5 fingers.
Where is this?
A sharp, searing pain jolted Ethan Blake awake, only to realize he was still engulfed in darkness. He tried to prop himself up, but his body was utterly drained of strength. Even the slightest movement sent a piercing pain from his broken wrist that seemed to cut through to his very bones. Ethan Blake took a deep breath, beads of sweat as large as peas rolling down his cheeks.
So this is a cave.
As his eyes gradually adjusted to the darkness, Ethan Blake finally discerned that he was in a fairly spacious cavern. Using his right hand, he fumbled around on the ground, finding himself lying on a thick layer of dry grass, still retaining a faint warmth.
Who brought me here? Could it be Lady Emma Watson has caught up with me? No, that's impossible. She was poisoned. She's probably already dead.
Ethan Blake lay on the dry grass, pondering for a long time, but unable to figure out how he had ended up in this cave. Ever since he encountered the Taoist Charles Green, everything felt like a dream, half real, half illusory, impossible to grasp. Deep down in his still naive heart, he clung to the belief that this was just a nightmare. That once he woke up, he would return to his mother's embrace, feeling her warmth. However, it was nothing more than a futile hope.
Sigh.
Ethan Blake shook his head, trying to dispel such unrealistic thoughts. The events of the past day and night were anything but a dream. They were real. His mother was gone. Moreover, 2 groups of people were hunting him, and falling into the hands of either would not bode well. Thinking of this, Ethan Blake's small heart couldn't help but tremble. His once familiar world had changed, becoming distant and cruel. A harsh reality now unfolded before his eyes. He reached for his waist. The short dagger and small gourd were still there. Then he reached into his chest, still there. He muttered to himself, Taoist. Uncle, what on earth is going on? Apart from your book, there's nothing else on me.
No one answered him. All he could hear was the cold wind howling outside the cave, wreaking havoc. Boom! 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 At that moment, heavy footsteps echoed through the cave, followed by a foul-smelling gust of wind blowing inside. Ethan Blake was startled, holding his breath, not daring to make a sound. Moments later, a tall, shadowy figure appeared before him. The dark figure panted heavily, its hot breath mixed with a pungent, fishy smell hitting his face. Is it a wolf? The thought flashed through Ethan Blake's mind, filling him with dread. But he quickly dismissed the idea. This figure stood upright and was far too large. Wolves, like dogs, couldn't possibly grow to such a size. A bear. Ethan Blake tensed up again. Having spent years surviving on the streets, he had heard tales of ferocious beasts like bears. Especially in the Icefield Nation, during snowy days, a type of beast called the snow bear was known to roam in search of food. According to the stories, snow bears were fierce and immensely powerful, capable of killing even a martial artist with a single strike. Recalling these descriptions, and comparing them to the massive shadow before him, the 2 images began to merge in Ethan Blake's mind, forming a picture of a ferocious, towering beast with a terrifying face. That's right, they said if you encounter a snow bear, don't breathe. Make it think you're dead, and it won't eat you. Amid his fear, Ethan Blake suddenly remembered someone once saying that playing dead could fool a snow bear. Thankfully, I wasn't breathing just now. Ethan Blake let out a silent sigh of relief, praying for the massive creature before him to leave quickly. However, things didn't go as he hoped. The enormous shadow not only showed no intention of leaving but even reached out and gave Ethan Blake a shove. Instantly, his heart leapt into his throat. The shadow, seeing no reaction from Ethan Blake, seemed a bit disappointed. It turned and walked to a corner of the cave, slumping to the ground and continuing to pant heavily before eventually settling down. In the darkness, Ethan Blake could only make out a faint silhouette. Seeing that the shadow didn't seem to be leaving, his anxiety grew. Before long, he felt his chest tightening, his head buzzing. If he didn't take another breath soon, he feared he might pass out. I can't hold it any longer, huff. Ethan Blake, though tough for his age, had limited endurance. As soon as the thought crossed his mind, he instinctively relaxed, greedily taking a deep breath. The cold air filled his lungs, bringing a sense of relief. Ethan Blake looked nervously at the shadow, but it remained still, faintly emitting soft snores as if it had fallen asleep. Huff. Ethan Blake exhaled deeply in relief, thinking to himself, could this thing not be a snow bear after all? Haze. Whatever it is, I need to get out of here first. With that thought, he endured the sharp pain in his wrist, propped himself up, and felt a cold breeze coming from ahead. Guessing it was the way out, he staggered toward it. Roar! Unexpectedly, the shadow, which seemed sound asleep, suddenly let out an angry roar, startling Ethan Blake so much that he fell to the ground. The shadowy figure panted heavily, got up, walked over to Ethan Blake, lifted him into the air, and shook him twice. It uttered guttural sounds before carrying Ethan Blake back to the pile of hay and tossing him down. It growled twice more, as if in warning, before finally settling down. This time, however, the shadow didn't move away but sat right next to Ethan Blake. A short while later, it began snoring again. Ethan Blake, shaken and dizzy from being manhandled by the shadow, took a long time to recover. Cradling his swollen arm, he dared not move a muscle. After several tens of hours without proper rest, Ethan Blake was utterly exhausted. Lying on the dry grass, he gradually succumbed to sleep. That shadowy figure, apart from blocking his way out, seemed to harbor no malice, which allowed him to drift off peacefully. His broken arm, now swollen and numb, no longer hurt as long as he kept it still. He slept soundly until the sun rose high in the sky, only to be awakened by the loud growling of his stomach. Beneath him, he felt something soft and warm, which made his resting spot incredibly comfortable. What is this? Ethan Blake muttered curiously as he reached out to feel around. Lowering his gaze, he was immediately startled, almost letting out a scream. By now, daylight had fully illuminated the cave, its cold light making the interior bright and clear. Thanks to the light, Ethan was shocked to discover that he had been sleeping on the belly of a massive polar bear. Clearly, this polar bear was the enormous shadow he had seen the previous night. Ethan quickly covered his mouth, swallowing his cry of alarm. This creature is enormous, he thought, carefully climbing down from the polar bear's belly. Upon closer inspection, the bear did not seem as ferocious as people often described. It lay there, resembling a giant fluffy ball of white fur, its sleeping posture even exuding a hint of cuteness. Being just a child, Ethan couldn't help but find the massive polar bear both silly and endearing. Since it had shown no hostility toward him the previous night, he began to relax. Looking at his swollen arm, which was now as thick as a leg and completely numb, he thought to himself that he needed to find something to stabilize it. Otherwise, the arm might end up permanently damaged. Scanning the cave, his eyes landed on a corner where several dry branches, about the thickness of a thumb, lay scattered. They appeared sturdy, so he quickly made his way over to them. Breaking a few dry branches, comparing them to his arm, Ethan Blake used a short dagger to cut off a piece of his robe and tore it into strips. Taking a deep breath, he steadied his left arm with his right hand, pressed it against the ground, and with all his strength, twisted it sharply. A cracking sound echoed, and it seemed the broken arm had been set back into place. Ignoring the searing pain, he quickly fixed the arm with the dry branches, wrapping the fabric strips tightly around it dozens of times until it felt secure. Only after tying it firmly did he stop. By the time he finished, sweat was pouring down his face from the pain. He remembered witnessing a wandering physician treat a beggar's broken leg in a similar way once, and had unconsciously committed the method to memory. He never imagined he'd have to use it on himself. Exhausted and in pain, hunger gnawed at him as he sat down on the ground, panting heavily. Suddenly, a noise came from behind him. The white bear had woken up, shaking its massive body and making a rustling sound. Ethan Blake turned his head and saw the bear's round, jet-black eyes staring straight at him, its tongue occasionally flicking out to lick its lips.
Could it be planning to eat me?
Ethan Blake thought,
fear creeping into his heart. The white bear seemed to sense his thoughts, letting out two muffled grunts before turning its head away. It swayed its plump body as it lumbered toward the cave entrance. Just as it reached the exit, it suddenly turned back, baring its teeth and growling at Ethan Blake.
Are you trying to stop me from leaving?
Ethan Blake seemed to understand the meaning of the white bear and asked.
Oh, roar!
The white bear let out a few strange sounds before leaving the cave. Watching the bear walk away, Ethan Blake finally dared to approach the cave entrance. Looking outside, he realized the cave was situated halfway up a mountain. In the distance, everything was covered in snow, with sparse trees and mostly rocky terrain. Farther out, he could see the shape of a small town, blanketed entirely in white snow.
Moonlight Hollow,
Ethan Blake thought for a moment. Although he had been running wildly the previous night, he hadn't gone far, and was still near Moonlight Hollow.
I wonder how Miss Emma Watson is doing. If she really died, Sophia Blake would surely be heartbroken.
Ethan Blake couldn't help but think of Miss Emma Watson. Though she was unpleasant, Sophia Blake had always treated him with genuine kindness. If Sophia were to grieve over Miss Emma Watson's death, Ethan Blake would also feel uneasy.
Maybe I should go to Moonlight Hollow and inform them.
Ethan Blake hesitated. Whether it was Miss Emma Watson, Daniel Carter, Lillian Moore, or that frail man named Clark, the abilities they displayed last night had left him wary. Especially Miss Emma Watson. She could turn snow into ice, and even injure people. It was truly unimaginable. These people all had their sights set on Ethan Blake. If he fell into their hands, his aspirations might never come to fruition. His mother, watching from the afterlife, would undoubtedly be furious. Ethan Blake finally found a suitable excuse for himself and thought, Miss Emma Watson is so powerful. She surely wouldn't die. She's probably already returned to Moonlight Hollow.
Sophia Blake, will we ever meet again?
Ethan Blake thought of Sophia Blake's porcelain doll-like appearance, and a pang of longing rose in his heart. Chapter 12, Departure.
What is that?
Ethan Blake stood at the entrance of the cave, gazing outside, his mind wandering. Suddenly, he noticed a dozen black dots in the distant sky rapidly flying toward his direction, and he couldn't help but be startled. What shocked him even more was that those black dots were actually people, standing atop strange weapons that emitted five-colored light. In the blink of an eye, they had already arrived above Moonlight Hollow. The black dots paused momentarily over Moonlight Hollow before locking onto the small mountain where Ethan was hiding and flew straight toward it. Instantly, an overwhelming pressure enveloped the entire small mountain, making it hard to breathe.
These people are cultivators,
Ethan muttered as he quickly retreated deeper into the cave, his heart pounding. Just 2 days ago, Charles Green had told him that powerful cultivators could ride weapons to fly and possess boundless magical power. These individuals were terrifying beings, far more formidable than Miss Emma Watson and that man named Clark.
Could they be looking for me?
Ethan's frail body trembled slightly with fear. The sheer aura of those flying figures was enough to make him feel immense pressure. Roar! 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 At the same time, an angry growl echoed from within the mountain, as if the white bear sensed something was amiss. Whoosh! 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 In just a single breath, Ethan heard the sound of wind slicing through the air outside the cave. Those people had already arrived at the entrance.
Senior Brother Brian, we've chased them all the way here, but we haven't seen any trace of that witch or the child. Could they have been taken by the people from Virtue Keep before we got here?
A voice outside the cave shouted loudly.
Let's search again. Forget about the witch named Watson, but we must find the child. What Charles Green left behind is crucial to the rise and fall of our cycle of souls order.
Another voice, calm and authoritative, replied. It seemed to belong to senior brother Brian. Hiding inside the cave, Ethan's heart raced wildly. These people were indeed after him.
Taoist uncle, what exactly did you leave on me?
He thought, trembling. Ethan Blake slowly moved his body, trying to go deeper into the mountain cave, filled with doubt. The sunlight was very strong at this moment, illuminating most of the cave's interior. If anyone looked in from the entrance, Ethan Blake would have nowhere to hide.
Daniel Carter, that fool, not only failed to capture Charles Green, but couldn't even deal with a mere child.
Senior brother Brian's voice sounded, filled with disdain. Immediately, another sharp voice chimed in, seemingly dissatisfied with Daniel Carter.
Junior brother Thomas Reed, don't be angry. Daniel Carter's incompetence this time will naturally lead to punishment from the disciplinary elder.
Senior brother Brian responded again.
William Ford was my cousin. To die so inexplicably, I'll settle this debt with Daniel Carter sooner or later.
Junior brother Thomas Reed said fiercely.
All right, let's focus on finding the person first.
Senior brother Brian said decisively, seemingly unwilling to continue the discussion.
Senior brother Brian, look, there's a cave over there. Let's check it out.
Someone said loudly at this moment. Buzz? Ethan Blake's head suddenly buzzed. It seemed the cave had been discovered. Instantly, two long shadows stretched into the cave, clearly indicating that two individuals had been sent to investigate.
What to do? What to do?
Ethan Blake cried out inwardly, his eyes scanning the cave, desperately searching for a place to hide. However, to his dismay, although the cave was spacious, there wasn't a single spot that could conceal his figure. If the intruders entered, he would have no way to escape. Roar, roar, roar. At this moment, the roar of a white bear echoed outside the cave, followed by heavy thudding footsteps that caused the ground to tremble slightly. The two figures approaching the cave immediately halted. Then, shouts and the angry roars of the white bear could be heard outside, mixed with the sound of rolling stones and snapping dry branches.
Phew!
Ethan Blake exhaled in relief, silently counting his blessings. If not for the sudden appearance of the white bear, he would have surely been discovered. However, just as a sense of relief began to rise, Ethan Blake frowned again. The people outside were all formidable individuals, and the white bear would likely face a grim fate.
Last night, the white bear must have saved me. A drop of kindness must be repaid with a river of gratitude,
Ethan Blake thought to himself.
Even if I am just a polar bear, I must repay its kindness.
Ethan Blake suddenly recalled Margaret Snow's earnest teachings. A determined glint flashed in his eyes, as he drew the short blade from his waist and prepared to step outside. Boom! A thunderous explosion erupted from the other side of the small mountain. Following that, the monks outside the cave shouted loudly,
Something's wrong! Senior brother Brian, senior brother Matthew Gray is already fighting someone over there. Let's go check.
Senior brother Brian immediately called out. In an instant, the sound of whooshing wind filled the air as the group swiftly flew away. All of this reached Ethan Blake's ears, causing his heart, suspended in tension, to finally relax. He quickly dashed out of the cave, only to see the snow-white fur of the polar bear soaked in blood. Its eyes, now red, glared fiercely at the fleeing monks. Though injured, the polar bear was far from defeated. Its sheer strength was astonishing. Seeing that the bear was fine, Ethan Blake couldn't help but glance into the distance. Far away, a green aura surged into the sky, as if piercing the heavens. Around the green aura, starlight sparkled continuously, accompanied by bursts of loud explosions as the stars flared. The dozen monks flew at incredible speed, reaching the area around the green aura in the blink of an eye, only to be engulfed by the starlight. Ethan Blake stood frozen, utterly mesmerized. He could hardly believe such a wondrous sight existed in the world. More astonishingly, this marvel was man-made.
So, this is what it means to be a monk,
Ethan Blake thought to himself, his heart brimming with hope. The green aura remained steadfast, refusing to dissipate, like a pillar of smoke. The starlight surrounding it seemed intent on piercing through but failed, instead scattering chaotically around it. Occasionally, the stars collided with the aura, producing deafening blasts. After a long while, Ethan Blake finally snapped back to reality. Taking a deep breath, he gained his first real understanding of what it meant to be a monk. Approaching the polar bear, Ethan Blake patted its massive body and said,
"Big guy, thank you for saving me. But I can't stay here any longer. I'm sorry."
With that, he turned to leave. Roar! 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 Unexpectedly, the polar bear roared repeatedly, using its enormous body to block Ethan Blake's way. Its small eyes stared intently at him, huffing and puffing.
"I'm truly sorry, but I must leave. If they come back, they'll kill me, and even drink my blood,"
Ethan Blake said anxiously, as he saw the white bear blocking his path.
"Grr!"
The white bear growled softly, then opened its mouth, gently grabbed Ethan, and tossed him onto its back. It let out a deep roar, glanced back at its cave with resolve, and turned decisively to run down the mountain. Ethan was stunned by the bear's actions, initially not understanding what was happening. When the bear threw him onto its back, he began to grasp its intentions, feeling a surge of joy in his heart.
"Are you planning to come with me?"
he asked. Before he could finish his sentence, the white bear had already started sprinting. Ethan quickly grabbed onto its fur, pressing his body close to its back to avoid being jostled off. Though the white bear appeared a bit clumsy, its speed was astonishing. In no time, it had reached the foot of the small mountain. Ethan oriented himself, patted the bear's head, and directed it to run northward. The sound of the wind howled in his ears, and Ethan dared not open his eyes. He clung tightly to the bear's back, letting it carry him at full speed. They ran north for over 20 miles in one stretch. The small mountain gradually disappeared from view, and even Moonlight Hollow grew distant. The white bear, having exerted itself for so long, began to tire. Its pace slowed until it was merely trudging through the snow. Fortunately, they had left the perilous area far behind.
"Thank you, my big friend,"
Ethan said loudly, still perched on the bear's back. He looked around and realized they had left Moonlight Hollow's territory and entered a vast ice field. Not far ahead stood a sprawling mountain range.
"Once we cross that range, we'll reach the Wu Kingdom,"
Ethan muttered, racking his brain to recall its name. After some thought, he deduced it was Storm Peak Ridge. Though not particularly tall, the range stretched thousands of miles, serving as a natural barrier. Within the mountains lay a path jointly developed by the Wu Kingdom and the Icefield Kingdom, allowing merchants from various nations to pass through. Along the route were relay stations where travelers and envoys could rest. Ethan had heard about these details from local tales, but he had no clue where the path actually began. Besides, riding a giant bear made it impossible to take the usual route even if he knew its location.
"Ha ha, my big friend, it seems we'll have to find our own way across this snowy mountain range,"
he said. Before he could finish, his stomach let out a loud growl.
"Ugh, this place is desolate. No villages ahead, no inns behind. Where can we find food?"
As soon as his stomach growled, hunger hit Ethan like a wave, his belly burning with an intense craving for sustenance.
"Why can't I endure hunger like this? Before, I could go days without eating and still manage,"
Ethan Blake muttered to himself, rubbing his stomach. The white bear beneath him seemed to understand his words, shook its head, and looked around. Its gaze finally settled on a spot not far away, and with a loud call, it dashed off. Ethan Blake, puzzled, waited for the bear to approach the area before he could see clearly. It turned out to be a medium-sized lake, now covered with a thick layer of ice. The white bear shook itself, signaling Ethan Blake to get off. He slid down along its soft fur. The bear circled the frozen lake, eventually finding a thinner section of ice. Suddenly, it stood upright on its hind legs, raised its front paws, and struck down forcefully. The white bear appeared to have excellent control over its strength. With just one strike, a loud crack echoed as a large hole appeared in the ice. What was most remarkable was that there wasn't a single crack around the hole. The bear crouched by the edge of the icy hole, extended its paw into the water, and pulled out several carp, each over a foot long. It tossed them onto the ice, leaving them flopping around.
Ha ha, so this big guy knows how to fish. Looks like we won't go hungry this time.
Ethan Blake's eyes lit up as he clapped his hands and laughed heartily. Hashtag Chapter 13, The Roadblock.
Finally, no more starving.
Ethan Blake rode on the white bear, carrying a long stick over his shoulder, skewered with 5 or 6 carp weighing 2 to 3 pounds each. The white bear had caught quite a few fish from an icy cave. Ethan gathered some dry branches nearby, used flint to start a fire, grilled a few fish, and enjoyed a hearty meal. The remaining fish were skewered onto a relatively straight dry branch, save for when hunger struck again. Though still young, Ethan Blake, accustomed to a life of begging, always carried flint and salt with him. Whenever he caught anything, he would light a fire, cook it thoroughly, and then eat. Naturally, these survival skills had been taught to him by Margaret Snow. Compared to other children his age, Ethan was already quite mature. After filling his belly, Ethan rode the white bear across the icy plains, arriving at the base of Storm Peak Ridge. Storm Peak Ridge stretched for thousands of miles, perpetually blanketed in snow. Only during spring and summer would the snow at the mountain's base melt slightly, allowing the locals to cultivate crops. In winter, these villagers would head into the mountains to hunt, leading reasonably prosperous lives. As Ethan reached the base of the mountain, a small village came into view. He could faintly see people moving about. After some thought, he slid off the white bear's back, patted it, and said,
"Snowy, find a place to hide. I'll scout the village for information, and then we'll head into the mountains."
During their journey, Ethan often talked to the white bear to stave off boredom, eventually naming it Snowy. Leading Snowy to a concealed spot, he hid the bear before heading toward the small village. Calling it a village was generous. It consisted of just over 20 houses, sparsely built. Amid the heavy snowfall, only a few people were busy outside, mostly gathering firewood to keep warm. Ethan, thin and dressed in light clothing, slowly walked into the village through the snow, immediately catching the attention of the villagers. 2 or 3 burly men put down their tools and approached him. These men wore animal skin coats, and their fur-lined boots looked heavy but were actually lightweight and warm.
"Hey kid, where are you from?"
one of the men asked loudly, his voice full of vigor, clearly someone who practiced martial arts.
"Moonlight Hollow,"
Ethan replied without hesitation.
"Alone?"
The man seemed curious. He couldn't fathom how a 7 or 8-year-old child could travel alone in such freezing conditions. It was almost unbelievable. As he spoke, his gaze swept over Ethan. Noticing the dagger at his waist, the gourd hanging from him, and the bandaged arm, the man's heart stirred as he thought,
"This child is traveling alone, injured and armed. Could it be he's fleeing from someone trying to kill him?"
Thinking of this, the man turned his head to look at the others. Everyone appeared puzzled, seemingly sharing the same thoughts as him. Observing their expressions, Ethan Blake noticed the confusion on their faces, even a hint of worry in their eyes. Instead of answering the man's question, Ethan took a small piece of silver from his pocket and said,